Please take your seats. The program is about to begin. Please take your seats. The program is about to begin.
After 2 years of upheaval, the world is slowly moving on from the pandemic. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine is triggering a refugee crisis and upending an already fragile recovery. Inflation is at an all-time high, exacerbating the wealth gap. Corporate America vowed to examine its own record on race after George Floyd's murder. But how do we measure accountability beyond the slogans? While ESG has become front and center in almost every industry, how can corporate leaders balance stakeholder priorities with shareholder interests? At the Bloomberg Equality Summit, we bring together leaders across the globe to map out solutions for advancing equity and inclusion in a deeply fractured world. This is the Bloomberg Equality Summit.
Please welcome to the stage Broadway, television, and film actor and producer Brian Terrell Clark, performing a soulful rendition of Stephen Sondheim's No One Is Alone.
Good morning. How's everybody feeling? It's going to be a great summit. Buckle up. Song goes like this, listen. No one here to guide you. Now you're on your own. Only me beside you. Still you're not alone. No one is alone. Truly, no one is alone. Sometimes people leave you halfway through the wood. Others may deceive you, but you decide what's good. You decide alone. But no one is alone. People make mistakes. Fathers, mothers, people make mistakes, holding to their own, thinking they're alone. Honor their mistakes. Everybody makes one another's terrible mistakes. Witches can be right, giants can be good. You decide what's right, you decide what's good. Just remember that someone is on your side. Someone else is not. No, no, no. But while you're seeing your side, maybe you forgot that they are not alone. Oh, no, 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 no. 'Cause no one is alone. Hard to see the light now, believe me, I know. Just don't let it go. Things will turn out right now. We can make it so. 'Cause someone is on your side. No one is alone. God bless you. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Bloomberg LP Chairman Peter Grauer.
Good morning, everybody. Can I hear a little bit more than that? Good morning, everybody. All right. It's been a long time since we've been together like this, so we need to be embracing it more enthusiastically. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for being here. And Brian, thank you for opening things up for us. I'm Peter Grauer, the chairman of Bloomberg, and to say I'm delighted to be here would be an understatement, and welcoming you to our 5th Equality Summit. It's exciting to be back in person this year. Since the last time we were able to hold the Equality Summit in person was March of 2019, which just seems ages ago, and clearly it was. This year's summit theme is measuring the movement, accountability in action. Let me say that again so we all take it in. The theme is measuring the movement, accountability in action, which of course I think is great because Mike Bloomberg's attitude is, and I quote, "If you can't measure it, you can't manage it, and you sure can't fix it." As you all know, the dual shocks of COVID-19 pandemic and a profound reckoning on race sparked a global movement in 2020. Rallying calls for change quickly shifted to calls for racial and economic equity. And now, nearly 2 years later, calls for measurement and accountability. The push to create a more equitable workplace, and society at large is being driven by various stakeholders, each with their own list of priorities. Investors want intentionality, employees want empathy and accountability, and consumers want change. The questions for corporate leaders becomes, how do we effectively balance stakeholder priorities? How do companies identify quick fixes to demonstrate progress while also working on long-term systemic changes. How do you measure the pace of progress? And which data tools, tips, and technologies are necessary to drive change? Today and tomorrow, we look forward to convening leaders at the forefront of advancing equity and inclusion to discuss concrete ways we can make change. At Bloomberg, I am particularly proud of the work we've done in the last few years in two areas in particular. First, the Bloomberg Gender Equality Index, which this year had submissions from over 550 global companies. The threshold for inclusion in the GEI, based on both disclosure and data performance, has increased, but so has the membership list, which means that companies are committed to more than just disclosure. They are committed to improving their metrics. And secondly, our new Voices program, led by Laura Zelenko, who you'll be hearing from shortly. In 5 years, New Voices has trained more than 300 female and underrepresented executives globally, and we have tripled the representation of female guests on Bloomberg television. And now it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Shartia Brantley, Deputy New York Bureau Chief and Senior Editor of Bloomberg Live, to kick things off. Thank you and have a great time.
Good morning. Good morning. I just want to echo Peter and say thank you to Brian Terrell Clark for sharing your gifts with us this morning. We felt that you cannot return in person and not amplify an industry that is so critical to New York City, and that is Broadway. And you all will hear more from Brian and Crystal Joy Brown shortly. Peter, just want to say just thank you so much for that introduction. You know, his presence here today means so much. He has been such our advocate at Bloomberg LP when it comes to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, not only at Bloomberg, but Peter also serves as founding U.S. chairman of the 30% Club. So again, welcome to the Bloomberg Equality Summit. If you're joining us online, welcome. And again, it's so good to see many new faces as well as many familiar faces. So just so delighted to have all of you here and to be back together again. As Peter mentioned, this is the 5th year of the summit. We launched this event in May 2018, and we remain proud to host these very important conversations on advancing equity and equality in the workplace and in society at large. Our theme is measuring the movement, accountability, and action. Today, we'll hear from leading voices in business, finance, technology, education, venture capital, politics, and entertainment. We will discuss strides made and challenges that remain, as investors, employees, and customers are all emboldened today to tell businesses exactly how they feel at this moment. But with so much going on, there is a view that our attention is beginning to wane in this area. We polled the Twitterverse with the following question: what progress has been made when it comes to D&I within corporations? Nearly 25% feel they have seen tangible progress, while the vast majority, a whopping 75%, say this is mostly a tick-the-box exercise. So let me ask you, how many of you think that you've seen tangible progress over the past 2 years? Can you raise your hands? All right, well, okay. Well, how many of you think this has just been a tick-the-box exercise? All right, see, that's why we're here today, because we have work to do, because we have made lofty statements. We've heard these things over the last 2 years, and frankly, people are over it. And we want to see the change. We want to talk about the journey, the good, the bad, and the ugly as you try to create a more equitable workplace. We want to have executives to be a little bit more vulnerable and talk about just how they themselves have been impacted over the past couple of years and how that has influenced their leadership. But I'll get off my tangent here and move on with the program. All right, before we get started, we'll have a couple of announcements. First, I would like to acknowledge our presenting sponsors, Boston Consulting Group, Syndio, and TPG. If you're joining us virtually and run into any technical issues, please use the chat box to the right side of the video window for support. You can also engage with other virtual event attendees there. For today's event, we have partnered with Thyssen, an audio-to-text platform that is transcribing today's discussions in real time, making the event more accessible. You can access Thyssen for the real-time transcription via the link in the session description. And we want to hear from you, so please engage with us on social media using hashtag Bloomberg Equality. Thanks so much for joining us and enjoy today's program. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Broadway television and film actress Crystal Joy Brown, Broadway television and film actor and producer Brian Terrell Clark, and Bloomberg's Chris Rouser.
Hi guys, we are so glad to be here, and I am thrilled to be here with Crystal and Brian. I'm such a Broadway fan and a fan of theirs, and can we get another round of applause for Brian singing? It was wonderful, one of my favorite songs. So we're here to talk about representation on Broadway, and the two of you know so much about this. Crystal, you're Eliza in Hamilton right now, which is such a hallmark show for representation. You were also in Hamilton, and you were in Thoughts of a Colored Man this fall, which was one of a whole slate of Black-led productions to come when Broadway came back. So I just wanted to start with a check-in. How do you guys think we're doing with representation?
Well, I definitely have seen a difference. My Broadway debut was in 2009, and I was in Hair. And as we've come back, over the period of the 18 months where we were shut down, we really started to focus on mental health, how we're talking about race, how we're talking about diversity and inclusion. And also in the Broadway world, we have never had an HR department. We've never had, there's no one to go to. You just kind of deal with it and move forward. And we didn't ever, especially as a person of color, you didn't really feel as though there was the ability to say anything. And during that 18 months, our company in particular really focused on how do we open up the dialogue, how do we talk about people's concerns when it comes to wigs, or how we even just every little like minutia of being a person of color in the theater, and really laid it out there and really talked about it, so that when we came back, we did more of a holistic approach. We had a healer who would come in the first hour and a half of rehearsal every single day. We did yoga and meditation, and we had a pallet on the floor, you know, in the side, where people could come and cry because we hadn't been together. We had been isolated, and we have to put ourselves out there in such a vulnerable way that it's terrifying. And so it was really a big concern to Hamilton and for me to come back into the space where we were really being honest with where we were and where we wanted to go, especially when we had made all of these kind of promises and decisions during the break, during that 18 months of being like, okay, we're going to come back and we're going to be social justice warriors, and we're going to lead Broadway in how we talk about diversity and inclusion. We're going to get an HR person. We're going to get a social media manager. Like, yes, but we also have to start like from day one, rehearsal 1, 2. And so that was like the biggest change, is just seeing the humanity coming into Broadway and talking and being able to say these things, which a lot of times we don't have the power to say. So the fact that we can even say anything has been one of the biggest changes for me.
Yeah, it's huge. You know, we all know that there's a big difference between representation and inclusion.
Yes.
And so what I can say is that I think that as an industry, both on Broadway and the Hollywood space. We've done a pretty good job. It's a marathon. We still got work to do, but we've done a good job at representation. Representation is about the numbers. It's about the data. It's about race. It's about gender, and now sexual orientation, right? So with the success like our show, Hamilton, you can see the representation. Inclusion is a different thing.
Yeah.
Inclusion is about once you have those numbers and once you have those people, are they valued? Are they respected? And I do believe that as an industry, we're starting to lead the charge in that direction. You know, speaking to so many of the things that Crystal said, being in Thoughts of a Colored Man, where it was the first play on Broadway to be produced, designed, directors, and the actors, all people of color. The majority people of color. First time ever.
2021.
2021, right? And it was kind of great. There was a bit of a Forbes leak in February that that released some data that we were actually, of the 5 shows that were all written by people of color that premiered this season, we were leading the charge financially every week by a very large margin. Here's the thing, though. It's still an experiment. So George Floyd dies, and now as an industry, we want to do all these black shows. I think it's wonderful, right? However, we're doing these shows in an environment that's a test.
Yep.
We don't know how audiences are going to come back to Broadway, and many of those shows, if not most of those shows, closed because of COVID. And so we've still got some work to do. I think it's a beautiful thing to have representation. I think Broadway has done a great job of that. We are working and climbing and running in the marathon of inclusion. And the work has begun, but we got a lot of work to do.
Right. Like, to piggyback off of what you're saying is that all of these shows that were released in September, October, November of last year were under, once again, the harshest circumstances that we've ever faced in the Broadway community. And it was the experiment of, you know, our audience is going to come back. So once again, as Black people, brown people, given the hardest circumstances to thrive. And that's, again, like, how come we always have to have the hardest circumstances in order to prove ourselves? Or, okay, well, great, you guys did great in these really terrible circumstances. Or, well, it didn't do well enough to survive COVID, so we're shutting you down. And so it's those little things where you're like, was that truly changing the face of Broadway, changing the Great White Way, or was it a Band-Aid, here you go.
A ticking of the box.
Yeah, a ticking of the box. Yeah, a ticking of the box. But it is so imperative to have representation. And so it's just great to even have it. And we're like, yay, we got a foot in the door. But it's like, it's time really, truly to kick the door down and to be, and what ends up happening is that we really need ownership.
Yes.
You know, we have to be the owners, we have to be the creators, the producers, and we have to have more of a stake than just being a body that people can see and go, oh, great. But behind the door, every single other person who's making the real money is white. So that's important too to note.
And both of you are working on that. Both of you are reaching into the roots of where theater work begins and trying to bring in younger people. You're trying to educate people. Brian, can you talk about some of the work you've been doing in colleges and towns?
Absolutely, yeah. I've been doing a lot of work, y'all. Those of you who you know, we're talking to the leaders in D&I, right? So it's a little bit preaching to the choir. So you all know that, like, you know, this work requires a lot of self-care. And once I stepped out of the self-care that I needed to dig into in COVID, I put my hands to work again. I'm working with some powerful leaders in theater to create a nonprofit called Theater Equitable Marketplace. Theater Equitable Employment Marketplace. It goes by TEAM. And we have partnered with the Miranda Foundation along with my sister Ava DuVernay over at Array Crew. And we are fighting to get representation behind the scenes. I think, like I said, we've done a pretty good job of showing you that, you know, these brown faces sell on Broadway. However, behind the scenes, the spotlight operators, the electricians, props, costumes, we don't have enough diversity back there. And it really is an uphill battle because the unions are strong and a lot of that is family, you know.
Grandfathered in and all of that.
Grandfathered in, all of that. And so Ava DuVernay has led the charge in Hollywood. I've worked on 3 of her projects, and it is the most diverse crew I have ever seen in existence. And now we're trying to bring that to Broadway. And so we're creating fellowships that start at the high school level so that we can go to these arts programs nationally and we can say, hey, you are super talented, but we know that you can't afford to come to New York City on a free internship. And learn the craft, right? I had a friend in college who was one of the most amazing directors I've ever seen. And we had another friend, one was of color, one was not, who was an okay director. The director that's directing on Broadway right now is the one who could afford to come and shadow and take these internships for free. So we're trying to create a real pipeline here so that young people, and we're not even being ageist, it doesn't even matter how old you are, people who have the talent but have not been given the opportunity because they can't afford it, we're creating those fellowships and trying to knock the door down, as you said, backstage.
Yeah. And something that over the pandemic that we started at Hamilton is called Ham for Progress. Originally, we called it the Hamilton Racial Justice Task Force, and that was created in August of 2020, July, August of 2020. So we really focused on voting, and we partnered with Until Freedom, and we partnered with Ava DuVernay, and of course, like Luis Miranda is a part of our little coalition, to really make sure that everyone has the accessibility to voting. That was our number one, because that was like our most present issue. And even right now, as we move forward, a year later, we've done so much. We've worked with so many organizations that are incredible for a plethora of things. But even right now, we're figuring out ways how to get materials to the LGBTQIA+ community that's of color in Ukraine. We're figuring out ways to get fellowships in our theater, and we have 5 touring companies. We have so many outlets to bring kids in. And we also do something called Edugeham, which is once a month. They're the best shows ever.
It's my favorite show.
Yeah, it's typically kids who would not be able to afford to come to see the show can come for $10, and they see the show with their high schools, and they rent the whole theater for that Wednesday matinee, and it is so incredible. So we're trying to figure out ways constantly to make sure that, especially Broadway, which can be very elitist in a lot of ways. The ticket is expensive. It's not easy to get here. To make sure that there's accessibility, and also to make sure that the organization that we've created, Ham for Progress, has actionable items that people can do to stay engaged and figure out ways that they can actually, take the change that we talk about and actually make it into something. We also did, for our first time ever, we did 10 scholarships to incredible students, all types, not necessarily kids that are in the arts at all, kids that are going to figure out how to save the planet, quite literally. So it was exciting to look at their essays and their creativity, and they just really inspired us, and we hope to continue to be able to give in that way moving forward.
It's amazing, you guys. Brian, you said something, you say brown faces sell, and it's something that we've talked about, which is that D&I is also a business opportunity. And I want you to explain that.
It is, and I don't know why people don't see it. It's interesting to me. It is, because as we've spoken about earlier, what we're seeing in the D&I world, all of you are seeing, is that people are getting tired in the marathon, right? I speak often with corporations and with colleges. I work with Kepler speakers, and I had a conversation the other day that a lot of D&I speakers at the top of the George Floyd thing, hired. Everybody wanted to hear the story, right? And get the information and get the data. And now people are getting exhausted. And what's interesting is I don't think that people really understand that a D&I strategy is not just a moral thing for you to do. It's a growth strategy. Mm-hmm. It's a growth strategy. And I think when it comes to business, it's important to understand that. For example, we did Thoughts of a Color Man, the experiment. What we found is that we were grossing higher than any play at the time. Not only that, this is why it's important. Not only that, but over 50% of every audience were African American and people of color. Not only that, but about 61% had never been to a Schubert theater. So essentially, we expanded the audience base. I remember in 2016, I was the first African-American male to be the lead in a Humera commercial. But it's crazy because it scored the highest and became the gold standard for years. So the data is showing that when you actually do open the door when it comes to representation, you expand your base. So I'm a little confused. I think that we're often used to sell the thing, but now you have to ask us how we feel about it. and I also think that it's the wisest thing to do, and a lot of you have seen this. I think there's been a lot of embarrassing moments, particularly with a lot of brands and a lot of fashion spaces in the last 10 years. And not to quote Hamilton, but you just need the right people in the room where it happens.
Right.
We're actors, but we're also, I'm a content creator, I'm a speaker, and what ends up happening is they don't pull people in the room who are community verified.
I like that, community verified.
Have people in the room with you that are community verified. And the reason why that's important is because sometimes you don't want to hear this kind of sterile view of D&I work, right? But I'll come and rap some Hamilton to you, and then we can get into the conversation, right? So I think that it's important to even diversify the conversation around diversity and inclusion, and so that we can last the marathon, because it is going to be a marathon, and that's okay. We just need to learn how to take some water and take some breaths and make the journey a little easier, and that's where artists come in. Artists have always been a part, historically, of every major civil rights movement. And yet, we're always kind of consulted later. Bring us in the room. Bring us in the room.
The conversation is happening because, in large part, because artists are telling the stories that people hear and people digest, and that's something you guys have talked about, and I think it's so important to remember.
Yeah.
What are some of the changes you guys have seen behind the scenes in the past few years?
Oh man, I mean, honestly, definitely the elements of taking care of mental health. Like I said before, being able to speak about how we're feeling, having somewhere to go and not feel as though if you say something about what is going on with you that you will be considered a problem. As a Black woman, I always feel like I have to be perfect. I have to be, if I even look a certain way, then I could be construed as angry, or I could be difficult. That's, I mean, as a woman, period, your voice goes a certain way, you're shrill, just everything is always really, really looked at. And I do believe that people are hearing me and seeing me differently. But that's also because I'm also looking at myself differently. I'm not saying that I have to be in a box that the society created that I have to be. I can be more representative of myself and of my people, so that I can create that pathway, because I think that we often have been told to be in this box, and you have to be the representative self, the representative Black, the representative version of yourself in order to be in these predominantly white spaces, because you don't want to scare them. You don't want to get anyone going like, oh, well, she's difficult, or she's going to say something. I'm like, no, I love this. I love Broadway. I love Hamilton. I want to make it better. Like, bring me on to make it better. I don't want to tear it down. I want to build it up. I believe in this thing. So the more that I've been able to really speak my truth, and the fact that I've been able to do that at Hamilton, and I hope to bring this on to every job that I have, and it has given me the strength. I've done a movie where I asked for a Black hair and makeup person, and like the first time I've ever asked for a Black hair and makeup person, or someone who specialized with Black hair and makeup.
Amen.
And I was terrified, but I think that this, being in the Broadway community, being with my people who are willing to sit down and say, what is it, what's going on, has allowed me to show up differently. And that's been something that's been major. I just think the listening, and then the other major thing that happened to me during the pandemic is that these amazing group of women producers invited me into the room. They invited me, there's weekly Zooms, and we sit and we talk about what's happening in Broadway. Some of them are with the Broadway League. I would always give the actor's opinion because I was the only actor, but they're like, you're gonna be a producer. We know it, you're a producer any minute. And I'm like, the fact that this, these women, predominantly white women, invited me in to learn and are inviting me in to potentially be on the ground floor of investing. That's a big change. That never happened to me before. So I'm always saying, invite us in. You know, it's not just going to be us kicking the door down. These white spaces or these homogenized spaces of any sort have to be willing enough to let us in and invite us in.
Yeah, and I totally agree. Totally agree.
This is the part where we talk about what you in the room can do.
Yeah, because I think
you watching on Zoom.
Totally. I think that the thing that's consistent about every marketplace is that it's ever shifting and it's ever changing, right? And so I think that, to piggyback off of what you were saying, that resonated so deeply with me is that the difference now is that you can't just kind of throw a black face on a product that's not authentic, right? So for us, you know, we look at colorblind casting and things like that, and I think that there was a world and a time where we could do a Doll's House and just make it black. Or we could do, you know, a Shakespeare piece and just kind of make it black, and that was enough. But now I think in every marketplace, what's ringing true is authenticity. Right. It has to be authentic. And so that's where we kind of come in. This is, you know, you were asking the questions, you know, how can we help? How can we push the movement forward? Authenticity. Right. Authenticity. Ask people into the room, listen to people who don't just have the data and the book smarts, but have lived experience. And that's what I mean by community verified. You want people in the room to help push and expand whatever you're doing in the marketplace that have an authentic voice. That's what's going to make your space in the marketplace different. You know, I had a casting director when I first graduated who said, let's just say lemons are the thing that everybody wants today. So what happens is everybody tries to make themselves a lemon, not knowing that the only consistent thing about a marketplace is that it changes. So next week we want an apple, and you've been trying to be this lemon. So now you're this weird apple lemon thing. Crazy metaphor, but my point is this. My point is this.
I get it. I get it.
In the D&I space, bring your authenticity. Bring your authenticity when it comes to being hired to create content for brands, when it comes to being asked to speak often, as I am in brands. I used to think that I had to come in and be extremely scholarly, and people are tired of that. People want authenticity. Authenticity is what sells. Authenticity is what makes us as human beings respond. We don't buy based on the data. We buy based on how we feel. And I will connect to you and I'll feel the resonance of you if it's authentic. And that's where you can come in. Bring in authentic people.
I just want to add one tiny little thing, which is you keep saying the word expand, and it just makes me always think of the universe is constantly expanding, right? Like, and so is our world of the arts, of our world of concepts of gender, race, sexuality, all of that is all expanding, and there is more. And I think that a lot of times we think with a lack mentality, which makes us go, if this person gets something, I'm gonna lose something. And that's when people start having scapegoats. That's when people start having fear, and they forget that there is actually a really broad, wider scope that we're creating. There's more networks than ever, there's more theaters, there's more artistic spaces. And so we have to think more and not less. We have to think that we're working with, in coordination with the universe that is expanding, and we're just bringing this out. Because we were here, and now we're getting wider and wider, and I think that that's the beautiful thing about where we are at this point, which is what should propel us to continue to do this work, because there are changes. We're seeing it. We are it. Yeah. We've seen it in our careers, and we've seen it with where we're going, and so it's continue to expand as much as we possibly can, and remember, there is enough for us, all of us.
Because that lack mentality is based in fear.
Yeah.
Right? Let's just be honest. Everybody's afraid. Everybody's afraid to try something new. Everybody's afraid of change. But I think what we're learning is that if you lean into the change, you'll actually find exponential progress.
And growth.
And so, like I say, a D&I strategy is a growth strategy. And so we want to make sure that we're also leaning into that. It's not just a moral thing. It is a moral thing. But let the fear go and allow your business to expand, allow your work to expand, allow your consciousness to expand. Yeah. And that's the kind of work we're doing.
Yeah.
Guys, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. We are out of time.
Thank you,
Please
guys,
give a round of
for
applause
having us.
for Crystal and Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Right, have a
Please welcome to the stage Independence Point Advisors founder Ann Clark Wolf. The Carlyle Group co-founder and co-chairman David Rubenstein, and Bloomberg's Shonali Bosick.
Thank you all for having us. I don't know how we compete with Broadway, but Anne, you've spent more than 3 decades now on Wall Street. You finally left, started your own firm. I'm curious about your end game. What is the ambition here of having a woman-led firm that stands apart from the investment banks you've worked for, Citigroup, JP Morgan, Salomon Brothers?
Thank you for having me, and it's great to be with both of you today. I spent 32 years thinking that I could try to change Wall Street from inside, and very loudly tried to do that. And finally, when I made the decision in December of 2020, post-COVID, to think about the next chapter, I realized I didn't want to leave Wall Street with less diverse people in high-earning seats than in 1990, which is what it felt like from my own experience. And so I saw a clear opportunity that as companies and clients have clearly embraced the ESG movement, it was amazing how little representation there was on the most important advice the clients need around mergers and acquisitions, IPOs, and other strategic transactions.
Now, David, something interesting that many people don't realize about Carlyle, the firm that you co-founded, was that for many years it actually had more women at senior level roles, money managing roles, than most of the industry.
And still.
Yes, still to this day, more than half of Carlyle's assets are managed by women, which you cannot say across the industry. How did that become the case?
Well, I'd like to say it's because I decided that's what I wanted to do. But the reality is, to be honest, we started our firm in Washington, D.C. We didn't start it in New York. And in New York, if you were starting a private equity firm, you would tend to get people from investment banks. Investment banks were not at the cutting edge at the time of, I'd say, gender equality. And so in Washington, while Washington has many problems for sure, we were able to recruit people who were living in Washington, and many of them tended to be people in companies that were not, let's say, as male-oriented as Wall Street. So we were able to get some very talented women. Now, as we expanded to New York and around the rest of the country, we took the same mindset, which is to get the most qualified people we could. And we were fortunate to have more diversity than many of our peers, and I still think we take a lot of pride in the fact that we have more women and more diversity than many of our peers. I don't want to say the others are not doing a good job, but we're pretty proud of what we've done in building out, I'd say, a firm that many people who have diverse backgrounds feel very comfortable at working at.
It's interesting you mentioned the challenges in investment banking, given that's where your background has been for so long. Why did you stick it through? And what were the challenges along the way that may still be there today, frankly?
So it can be the best job in the world, and that's really what I want to inspire, especially young women and diverse candidates who don't have exposure to the industry, to realize that you're working with companies, you're working with very smart people on opportunities that you can read about in the paper or see on Bloomberg TV the next day. That's a very rare privilege, in my opinion. But I think there's also, it's fair to say, the work approach hasn't changed in 40 years. The notion of a 100-page presentation that somebody's working on at 2 in the morning, the world has changed, and I'm excited to be part of thinking about how do you modernize this industry, since advice doesn't have to be conducted in the same way that it was when I started my career in 1989.
Now, look, diversity means many different things to many different people. I'm Jewish, and for a long time, people on Wall Street, many people discriminate against people who were Jewish. There's a different types of diversity that we're talking about. We're talking about now not having religious discrimination, not having gender discrimination, not having sexual preference discrimination, not having ethnic and racial discrimination. It's a sea change that I didn't think when I was younger I would live to see, because for most of organized history, there's been this prejudice against women, certainly, and for people who are in minority status in a given society. And the United States has taken the lead, though a number of Western European countries have done a good job as well, of actually saying, no, we need to hire the most qualified people. And the United States, I think, has done a reasonably good job in recent years in catching up, but we still got a long way to go. There's no doubt that we're not going to be at 50-50 in terms of women and men professionals running money management firms anytime soon. It's still going to take a while. I think you would probably agree with that. It's going to take a while. And if you take a look at the areas that I think most progress have been made, the law firms probably have made more progress than the investment banks. Investment banks have made more progress than the private equity firms. The private equity firms have made more progress than the hedge funds. I think the hedge funds have made more progress than the venture funds. So there's a long way to go. And I think now we want to be in a situation where it's not a story that a woman is running a major firm, or it's not a story that somebody who is gay or bisexual is running a major firm. You don't want those to be the stories. You want people not to focus on it. We're still not there yet.
Well, I think one of the reasons I've always been passionate about this is because the financial industry, the center of capital, doesn't look like the community it serves. So what's at risk here if things don't change, given the numbers are so bleak already in terms of the people who are able to access venture funding, private equity funding?
Well, the theory behind, there's one theory is that everybody should be treated equal. And that's a very good theory, part of our Declaration of Independence, although obviously that was written by somebody who didn't really believe in it, perhaps. He had 200 slaves and other things, so he still said that all men are created equal. He didn't say all women are created equal. He said all men are created equal, and he really meant all white Christian male men are created equal. But leaving that aside, what you want to have is a situation where people feel that they represent society. And so and the reason you want to do that is that you're going to be making better decisions. If you have 50% of your customers are women, but you have no women in your decision-making process, how likely are you going to be able to figure out what women really want as their customers? The same thing is true with lots of boards I'm on. A lot of nonprofit boards or corporate boards, I keep saying to them, why don't we have people who are younger? Because there's some discrimination against younger people on boards as well. It's not quite the same as gender discrimination, but when you're selling products for young people or you're dealing with software companies, you should have younger people on the boards because, and the same is true in the nonprofit area, because many of the people who are making decisions to participate in your organization or buy your products are younger. Yet very often you see boards looking at sort of like me, white-haired, old white guys.
You know, it's interesting, and you've mentioned this as a supply-side problem as well as a demand issue here. It's not just Wall Street, right? It's everybody. What are the problems on the client side that you can see being fixed?
So I pick up on a couple of the themes that David mentioned. First and foremost, this is a client-driven business, and they're not going to sacrifice exceptional talent. The good news is, in less than 4 months, I've proven that you can have the Venn diagram of exceptional talent that is more than 70% diverse. And so our launch team, who are some of the best trained people on Wall Street, is a representation of working mothers for African Americans, openly out LGBTQ, Hispanic Americans, and Southeast Asian women. And it's not hard to find people if you can create the ecosystem and the opportunity that really allows them to thrive. I think this will ultimately be driven, and the timeline will be driven by CEO demand. And so I dream of the moment when we are sitting next to a CEO of a major company announcing a big M&A deal, a big IPO, and they voluntarily say, this team, because of their expertise first and foremost, whether that's on ESG, cybersecurity, or the other topics we've invested in, but this team's expertise and the fact that they, to David's point, represent our customers, our stakeholders, they made my decision better. And I think the data is pretty clear that cognitive diversity does lead to better decisions. That moment when the first CEO says, I saw the benefit and I made a better decision, I think that's what drives the pace of change. And we're excited for that to happen really soon.
Now, the pace of change, David, something you had mentioned before, it could take a long time. How long?
Well, we've been at civilization for thousands of years. When you think back on it, it is amazing how rapid the change has occurred in the last 20, 30 years, relatively speaking. So organized, people came out of caves as Homo sapiens 400,000 years ago. And for most of that 400,000 years, men dominated everything, I would say, and majority people, white, let's say in a country like this, dominated things. Now, just in the last, I would say, 30, 40 years or so, you've begun to recognize that actually people who are different, who are diverse, who might be minorities, actually have some incredibly good capabilities, and you're seeing things change dramatically. And it's interesting, take racial equality. We've had slavery for several hundred years. We ended it in 1865, but then with the Jim Crow laws, we had another 100 years of essentially non-slavery, but a terrible situation for African Americans. Thousands of lynchings occurred in the 20th century. It was hard to get the Civil Rights Act in 64, hard to get the Voting Rights Act in 65 passed. But with all those things, we still didn't really have equality. Yet when the George Floyd murder occurred, it's amazing how one murder, and there were so many murders like that before, one murder really galvanized the business community to say we've got to do a much better job. So I think there hasn't been quite an equivalent event with women. Fortunately, there's nothing quite like that. But I think needs to be a galvanizing event that makes it clear to men that actually we have to make even more progress. So how long is it going to take? It's going to take longer than I'm probably going to be around on the planet Earth to have everybody be treated completely equally. We probably are not going to be there quite as quickly as I think we should be. But we've made enormous progress just in the last, I would say, decade or two compared to where we were when you started in Wall Street. When you started in Wall Street, I suspect, and when I was starting Carlyle, there weren't that many women in the financial service world or private equity world, the venture capital world. It's changed dramatically. It's still not where it should be, but it's not going to happen overnight, in my view.
I'm a believer, though, in capitalism. And so when I think about whether it's appropriate or inappropriate, what works on Wall Street are very clear incentives and penalties. And so, and I espoused in the large organizations I was part of, the moment at which a trader loses $500,000 because they can't retain 80% of the diverse people who've been added to their team, or more importantly, the moment when a leader puts forward a woman on the most important transaction and sees a $500,000 benefit, I think capitalism works. Now, it's not happening within the organizations, so where it will happen, the power is with the clients. And the excitement about the rise of stakeholder interest and shareholders being so vocal on this is clients drive the change, and Wall Street always responds to the client demand. And as David said, going through, from bottoms up, from companies to private equity firms to VC firms, I actually think that we're very close to that point where if shareholders can quantify the benefit that they attribute to these firms, you'll see the change.
I think to some extent we're still a little bit in the check the box category. Totally. We want to check the box. We've done diversity. Now we'll go about our business the way we did before, but now we have enough things so we can say we check the box. When we're not quite really in the category of, yes, there is absolutely no discrimination at all and everybody is equal.
And sometimes it's not just blatant discrimination, but a matter of blatant misunderstandings. One story I've given both of you is I walked into an investment bank about 8 years ago, spoke to a president, and he said, there's no place for women here. The reason he said that, was because women drop out of the workforce in their 30s. So, I'm curious about what you think about this. This is because they have children and so on and so forth. Both of you have talked about, a workplace environment that can be more conducive to women thriving. So what do you think it is that managers are not understanding about the way that women rise in their own workforces?
Let me give you at least one statistic. So in my entry class at Solomon Brothers in 1989 in investment banking, a class of 25, there were 8 women. Those 8 women are still all working today. They're just not working on Wall Street. And the majority of them had families and proved that you could do that. It's become a little bit of a convenient excuse for both women and men to want to believe that the work-life balance and family is why women leave. In my own opinion, as the mother of a 24-year-old and a 21-year-old, people leave because of lack of opportunity and lack of inclusion and lack of excitement about whether the time they're putting in to their day job is still as fulfilling. And again, those are all things that need to be corrected. One of our core tenets in the company I've launched is I've accepted the reality that people are not going to all want to work in Midtown Manhattan. We have a woman in Bend, Oregon. We have people in Atlanta. We have people in Austin, Texas. Is it hard? Absolutely. But is it the modern reality that that's going to be part of meeting people where they need to be, recognizing they have parents, children, and other demands on their life? That's going to be what it takes to have top talent.
For all of organized history, it's clear that in all societies, women have taken on a greater part of the child-rearing burden than men have. And until that really changes and it's really equal, I don't think you're going to have men looking at women quite the same way as they look at men because of the child rearing time responsibilities. Women often know that if any of you are women who are have children, when you are working, you don't tell your boss, your male boss, I have to go see my baby doctor for my child. I have to go do a school appointment for my child. You make up an excuse. You say, well, I've got to go see a client or something, because you don't want to tell your male boss, actually, I have to do something that's related to child rearing because I don't want you to think that I am less than 100% committed to the job. And I don't know whether you've had this kind of experience, but you probably see women are trying to hide the fact they're doing child caring things when in fact they shouldn't have to do that, but that's still the reality of the workplace.
Well, we were talking about this as better paternity leave policies as well as maternity leave policies, part of the equation here.
Well, I think we've made a lot of progress in working towards this, but the funny thing about the human brain is that when humans appeared on the face of the earth, you think the elephants were saying, hey, these people are going to dominate society and they're going to take over the world? You think the gorillas were saying, well, these people are going to take over the world? No, because we weren't as fast, we weren't as big, we weren't as strong as the animals they saw. But how do we take over the earth? How do we conquer it? Because the brain was better than anything else anybody else had. But the brain, for all of its incredible ability to produce Shakespeare plays or Picasso works of art or Einstein theories, still has a flaw in it, which says, if I look at you and you don't look like me, I don't like you as much as I like somebody that looks like me. So there's something in the human brain that just says, if you look different than me, I'm not going to treat you the same as somebody who looks like me. And until we change that flaw in the brain, I don't think you're going to ever have perfect equality.
And you put this in such a really interesting way in the frame of risk-taking. The idea that in the last year or so that people have not been willing to take a risk on the people that they don't know. How has that played out?
So I go back and pick up a little bit on one of David's points around authenticity. And the prior speaker, I thought, said it far more eloquently than I ever could. But we need both men and women to come into the job every day as their authentic selves. And David's absolutely right. Women hide the fact that they have child-rearing responsibilities. And what's interesting is I've been out recruiting, especially women, is when a woman says that their child has a soccer game at 10 a.m. on a Saturday and they can't join a conference call, she's actually told by her boss, you really shouldn't have said that. That's the part, and yet the man who says the same thing is celebrated as being the world's best dad. So I move beyond paternity leave. As any mother will tell you, the notion of paternity leave, while it may be a lightning rod issue, it's a defined point of time. And where you really need balance is across the 21 plus years of child rearing, not for a 2-month period where the baby sleeps the majority of the day.
So the dress code is another factor. Women feel they have to dress in an appropriate way to kind of look more like men. So someone once said to me many years ago, bankers don't have toes. In other words, women are not supposed to wear open-toed shoes in a business setting because it doesn't seem appropriate. And maybe it's changed, but women have to dress a certain way to kind of make men think that, at least they feel, make men think that they're comparable to them in the way they look at things. And, they're not really reflecting their personality to some extent because they're trying to adapt to what they think is the male-dominated fashion code.
I wore black the first 6 out of the 8 years of my reporting career on Wall Street for that same reason.
Okay.
I'm wondering also, let's kind of bring it in the vein of the last couple of years here as well. Ann, you and I have also acknowledged and seen so many women leave Wall Street. What have you heard and what are they telling you about this? Is it part of the Great Resignation or is it the lack of the willingness of Wall Street to change?
I think it's a combination of both. I do believe COVID has changed all of us. We all look at our life and say, how do we want to spend the quality time in our life, both with our family but also professionally, and what do we think will be the imprint that we want to leave when we look behind? And I go back to the 3 words that I use to recruit candidates, and they seem to be working because we're up to 25 people, are aperture. How do people think about, the majority of people on Wall Street sit in a very narrow swim lane that they've sat in for a long time. Certainly a lot of people are saying, I'd like to see something a little bit broader, a little bit different. The second word is opportunity, which is, I was fortunate in the ability to join a corporate board at a point in my career. I learned so much by that difficult decision of letting me experience another company and how they made decisions. And then the final word is transparency. I think people are capitalists. They are willing to work hard where they see what that can produce for their families, and that's gotten just very hard to see in the conventional firms. So you put all of that together, I ultimately think people are not leaving because they don't like the fundamental work. They don't like the setting in which they're being asked to somehow adapt to a world that's adapted, and it hasn't adapted within the four walls.
David, you had mentioned earlier that you saw how this had played out in Washington, you saw how it played out in the law firms and then on Wall Street. When you look around your peers now, do you have more faith in Washington or in corporate America to be a part of the solution for this problem?
Well, that's a Sophie's choice kind of answer. I don't think I can give a good answer without offending somebody that I'm going to see later today, I guess. But look, Washington reflects what the politicians there think the country wants, and so they're pretty good barometers. And I think the country is probably more open to some of these changes politically than maybe some people on Wall Street are. To be honest, Wall Street is a little isolated and insulated from the political pressures, not completely so, but a little bit. So I think Washington probably reflects the country much more than it's supposed to, than Wall Street. Wall Street is not supposed to be a democratic government organization, but I think Wall Street is moving in the right direction. It just moves a little more slowly than I think government does in Washington, D.C.
And do you think, because of that, do you think that D.C. needs to have more oversight on what's happening here? Do you think that there should be more rules, more people watching what's happening in the corporate sector?
So there are two ways to look at it. I think a lot of the progress we've made on diverse representation on corporate boards, I attribute to quotas that started in Europe. There was nobody who would say they wanted a quota in the U.S., but that external pressure that started in Europe and that came from a variety of different places has made a material difference in diversity on corporate boards. I go back to, I am a believer in capitalism, and I think that there's a way that rules won't lead to the change that's authentic, and I would rather have companies see they're missing exceptional talent, and if we encourage our diverse employees to show up as their authentic selves and actually call out that they're making the conversation a better, different conversation because they're different, I think that's going to lead the best CEOs to realize, why would I want to be missing that? It's a powerful part of making a better decision.
Okay, in any organization, to rise up, you have to adapt to the mores of the organization. That's inevitably the case. But I think increasingly in organizations, people should recognize that what they're bringing is not another white male mindset, but they're bringing their own diverse backgrounds. And to the extent that you can emphasize your differences, you're going to contribute to the corporation more or the entity more, because you shouldn't be saying, I can be like a white man who went to Harvard Business School and I'm just like the typical person who rises up in a private equity firm. You should want to say, I actually have some different perspectives, and those perspectives can be interesting to you and to our investors, our clients, and those are the ones I want to emphasize and not try to be like everybody else who's a white male.
We only have a couple minutes left here, and I'm wondering, of closing thoughts from both of you, if there's anything that you can challenge the rest of your industry to think differently about, what would it be?
I think the industry should be recognizing it reflects society, and to the extent that Wall Street wants to have less regulation and have less people from Washington telling them what to do, they should be more attentive to the needs of society and to the diverse populations we have. It wasn't recognized that diversity was a wonderful thing 200 years ago. People weren't running around and saying, we want to have a diverse population in the Continental Congress. They were all white men. The Constitutional Convention, all white men. Just think about our Constitution would look like, and maybe the country would be much better if you had a diverse Constitutional Convention. I often wonder, if we had a new Constitutional Convention, who would be there, and would we have really diverse representation, and how much better would the Constitution be if we had more diversity? So I just think the country is evolving. Wall Street is evolving more slowly than the rest of the country, but I do think it's made real progress in the last 20 or 30 years compared to what I would have expected 20 or 30 years ago.
I would just pick up on that. We live in a really complex world that I would say that has changed dramatically in the past 20 years. Technology's changed, kind of the geopolitical environment that we're living through right now, I think, is the perfect example of where being a corporate CEO is a harder job than it's ever been. And the notion of stakeholders that have a voice, and a very loud voice in the decisions companies make, has changed, which I think just requires that you need a diversity of thought and perspective and experience just to make those complicated decisions in a much clearer way. And I think it's an exciting moment, and I do think that there's an energy that's come out of the past 2 years to really try to finally hear those voices and reflect that in a powerful way.
Thank you both for such candid conversations, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
What could be more important than telling stories where everyone has a voice? That's not just good journalism, it's a responsibility.
The intent of the New Voices program really is to improve our coverage. And in early 2018, we decided to do a real analysis of our guests on TV and quotes in our stories. At that time, only 10% of our outside guests being brought onto TV for interviews were women. We knew that we really needed to do something intentional to change that.
The challenge is that a woman spokesperson who are usually as good and as able and have as much potential, they tend to get overlooked. And I think this New Voices program exactly addressed that challenge.
I was really driven to appear on TV because I am a big advocate for women in investment management, and you cannot be what you cannot see.
What have you thought to yourself about how to potentially participate in that kind of wealth?
It's a great question. So I think we at Florida A&M, to be able to be heard, I think is one of the best gifts that you can give anyone, whether it's heard on TV, heard in life. So the fact that the New Voices program allows people to be heard, I think it's just phenomenal.
Women just need a push, they need encouragement, they need the skills, and we can help them do that with the New Voices program.
We decided we at Bloomberg could sponsor intensive media training for senior female experts in cities around the world to not only address the gap that they were facing, but to also help us identify and discover new qualified female experts.
The reason why I think the New Voices program is so important is that it really empowers women. Yes, in media, but also in their jobs, in their careers. It gives them a platform. It gives them a voice.
After I came out of New Voices, I was able to give concise responses, crisp responses, and responses that really communicated what I wanted the audience to know.
If you put your mind to something, push your boundaries a little bit, get out of your comfort zone, anything's possible.
We started this program with 10% representation of outside female guests on Bloomberg TV. We tripled that within 3 years, and we want to keep pushing for the betterment of our coverage, for the betterment of the industry going forward. We're constantly expanding the program because that was the intention from the start. We named this program New Voices because we didn't want to restrict it to gender only, and we certainly didn't want to restrict it to the United States. We've also added cohorts of Black executives of all gender identities in the U.S. and Latinx executives of all gender identities in the U.S.
After receiving the media training for New Voices, I really felt like I got more skilled in being able to provide the answers and then provide the insights that I wanted to give.
It gave me agency in being who I am.
I think I've grown more confident as a person to express my points of view.
I think it's also important for the financial services industry to be able to see me represented, to be able to see people like me represented, and to know that I do have a voice.
Every week we try to do better than the week before. More female leaders given more time on air, more space on the airwaves.
And this kind of work is not one and done. You know, it's very easy to slip backwards. It's very easy to lose focus. And hopefully, if we stay focused, if we stay intentional, we actually will see real change.
Please welcome to the stage Bloomberg Senior Executive Editor and New Voices founder, Laura Zelenko.
Greetings, everyone. Yes, we are so thrilled to have this event back in person, and thank you for coming. I have been a journalist at Bloomberg News for 29 years, first opening all of our bureaus in Eastern Europe and Russia, and then leading global teams of journalists covering business, finance, markets. So I understand why it matters so much whose voices and perspectives we are drawing on to determine what stories to tell and how to tell them. It makes our coverage better, it makes our coverage more complete, it limits our biases, it limits our blind spots. I also understand why for many journalists it's very difficult to diversify sourcing. We're on deadline all the time, and a big part of our coverage area is the white male-dominated industry of finance. But it's 2022, so really there's no room for excuses anymore. We need to be proactive, and we need to be intentional. And this conference is all about accountability. We are so proud that we can show the data that we have actually tripled representation of external female guests on Bloomberg TV. But I can assure you that we're not stopping there. We have set even more ambitious goals for this year. We're hoping to get to 33%, and I expect we'll end the year even higher than that. We are also building out our database of female experts globally. We now have more than 7,000 names. We started with about 500 in 2018, and we hope to add another 3,000 this year. And we've created tracking tools to make sure that we're holding our managers accountable to producing more stories that quote or cite female experts. Now, what can you do? We would hope that you can turn to your networks, let them know that we're taking applications from senior women in finance in global cities, starting this year already with New York and San Francisco. Last night, we launched our cohort for Black executives in the US of all gender identities, and we're going to be going to several more cities throughout the year and also launching our Latinx executive cohort of all gender identities in the US later this year. Our goal is to identify and amplify the voices of more underrepresented executives across business and finance. And I'm really happy to say that our next panel includes two of our New Voices alumni, Miriam Rivera, Yulu Ventures CEO, co-founder, and managing director, Bahia Yasmin Robinson, VC Include CEO and founder, and Forerunner Ventures principal, KJ Sidbury. Thank you.
And I hope you've been enjoying yourself so far. I'm Renita Young. I'm a correspondent here at Bloomberg, and I cover several different things, including the Bloomberg Black Business Beat, and I have a show on personal finance that comes out. And today, we're talking about the VC show. We're continuing this theme of accountability and impact with our three fantastic guests here. And so, as you've heard, we have Miriam Rivera, Bahia Robinson. Miriam is the co-founding and managing director at Ulu Ventures. Bahia Robinson is the CEO and founder of VC Include. And KJ Sidbury is the principal at Forerunner Ventures. And so, a really appropriate place to start, I think, is in all of the corporate and other promises to support Black businesses and other underrepresented businesses that have come over the past couple of years. Taking that into account, guys, each of you, let me know what's your current view, of the state of VC funding for these underrepresented founders. Let's start with you, Miriam.
So we've seen many billions of dollars being committed to these areas. I think one difference is that some of that is being committed for philanthropic purposes and some for venture capital. So it's unclear what percentage went for which purpose and how much funding has actually reached African American and BIPOC founders. So that would be one of the things that I kind of challenge, which is let's hear the other side of the story apart from the commitments.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Bahia?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that, when George Floyd kind of sparked this global reaction to, and really a reckoning around how we invest and who's brought to the table, a lot of the corporations, as we know, kind of came to and said, we just want to do something, right? We want to commit $1 billion, we want to commit $500 million. But there was no real strategy behind that. And so where the commitment was great, what we, I think, saw, or at least what I saw, was a lot of questioning about now what? How do we actually deploy capital? What kind of capital is going to what type of markets or what type of regions, right? And so there was a bit of a scramble, and I definitely was on the side of, calls that said, what should we do now? And I said, you have $1 billion, we should probably work together to kind of figure out where we can have a multi-phased approach to deploy capital in a very responsible and holistic way. And so the theme of VC Include is making sure there's an education component on the asset management side as well as the asset allocator side. And there's also investment, right? So you can't just have mentorship and education without investment hand in hand. And so I think we're in the first phase of some of the deployment of that capital, and it's going to be very exciting to see that next phase of capital being deployed out of that larger pool that's been committed.
Absolutely. And KJ, from your perspective, tell us what you're seeing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I would certainly echo a lot of the sentiments that have been shared up to date. And personally, I hold both optimism and skepticism as it relates to the promises, particularly in the face of corporations relative to these types of circumstances and the deployment or the initiatives of capital. I would say from the VC perspective, where I belong as a member of the team at Forerunner, our commitment has always been to the deployment of capital and actually putting capital, finances, money, resources into the hands of founders, ideally diverse. And I think that's what it takes to kind of move the needle, because there's a very thin line between actually being able to promise and this kind of notion of diversity theater in which promises are made but aren't enforced. And while I love the intentionality, as been mentioned before, I think what's important is to really have deliberate steps, like an action plan against it, so that you make sure that you're holding yourself accountable and that there's actually durability and longstanding promise to some of these guarantees that are being made at this point.
Absolutely. Guys, I think that's a great baseline, because now I'm going to throw a few numbers at you that I want you to think about. Investments in Black founders, they quadrupled in the first half of 2021, reaching $1.8 billion. This is according to Crunchbase. And the same report showed that U.S. startups for Latino founders received just 2.1% of venture capital funding in 2021. And it was a VC funding banner year, but women received just 2% of all VC investment. But Miriam, the numbers don't really tell the whole story, right? So can you contextualize them for me?
So one of the ways to think about it is that this was a record-breaking cycle for venture capital. So the 2% is a big number in terms of dollars, but it's really a tiny percentage. It's also a tiny percent when you think, for example, that women are actually more educated than men at both the undergraduate and the master's degree level, and that they represent a huge part of the workforce, and we still don't fund even women. And I will say that we're really talking still about majority women, white women. And so from our point of view at Ulu Ventures, almost half of our teams have a woman on the team, which makes sense. And about a quarter of our CEOs are African American and Latino. Our funds are really successful, top 5, top quartile funds. And I think the mythology around pipeline continues to make people avoid investments that would be very profitable.
But here, I can see you shaking your head. So let us know what you're thinking. What's going on in there?
Yeah, I think when you go, so that's the kind of ground level numbers and the correlation. And then when you start to think about, again, up the funnel, then you look at the fund manager layer, the asset manager layer, and we see that 1.4% of now $80 trillion in AUM that's managed in the US alone is managed by women and people of color combined, right? And so it continues to kind of track to those numbers, 1 to 2% of investments made at the founder level right in that kind of 1% to 2% of asset managers that are represented, both women and people of color. And so, again, back to the holistic approach has to be both on the ground in terms of the investment, but also at the asset manager level. And that's really where we focus, is making sure inclusion is infused at the asset manager level around venture capital, around kind of ESG, right? Making sure that environmental and social governance is embedded at the fund manager level as well as the founder level. And so I think it's really important, again, to kind of have that holistic strategy and understand those numbers at the ground level and what's actually causing a lot of that correlation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. KJ, I want to ask you another question, a different one.
Sure.
Now, we pulled the Twitterverse ahead of this, and we wanted to ask what was the biggest challenge facing underrepresented founders. I'll let you know the results. You let me know what you think of them, if they really do seem this way from your corner of the world.
Sure.
Unconscious bias got about 35%, close to 35%. Lack of access to capital was 50.5%. I always hear that as the reason. But sexism and ageism came in at 14.7%. Does that sound like what you're seeing currently? And if not, what would you see as the biggest challenge facing underrepresented founders?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part that tracks, right? I think VC historically has been an ecosystem in which pattern recognition is something that's celebrated, right? You see success that translates in one arena, you work to duplicate or replicate that success in others. And so if you have an historical bench of founders that look a certain way, coming from a very specific type of background, generate some type of outcome for other firms, you're going to be like, oh, that's something that we should track against, that's something that we should follow, that is something that we should ultimately mirror. What that does is install this level of bias that doesn't favor underserved or underrepresented communities in pretty obvious and tangible ways, like the numbers have been kind of cited at this point. And so the fact that unconscious bias or bias at all is something that feels pretty significant in that benchmark study is not really a terrible surprise to me. The fact that access to capital is also an issue is also not a surprise, just because the hurdles associated with being able to be in the room, being able to access the folks that are deploying capital in pretty meaningful ways has been historically a challenge concept for various communities. There's progress being made, slowly, but hopefully surely, in a way to kind of course correct against that. But it's important to recognize that as an issue, as a little bit of a speed bump that deserves very specific attention.
Even getting more granular, you talked about being in the room. What I hear all the time when I speak with founders is just how important the relationships are, right? And how making the relationships with the right funders, with the right fund managers is important. Bahia,
lots to say
what can
about
you
that.
add about that?
Well, look, I mean, we talked about pattern matching. The asset manager layer is really important because when you look at total addressable market, right, when you look at these opportunities, we know that diversity outperforms the market. Why? Because it's diversity of thought, it's diversity of background, right? It's diversity of color. I mean, no one's a monolith. No one, organization or ethnicity is a monolith. And so we're really looking for that, inclusion to make better decisions on investments, right? And so when we're looking at 100 million or so, Black and Latinx or Hispanic populations that represent the U.S., if they're not folks that actually understand those markets, right, to understand the market opportunities, this is a massive market opportunity, then we're missing on alpha. We're actually, we talk a lot about fiduciary responsibility and, trust and trusting the market, trusting the people that you invest with, et cetera. But if we are not opening that lens, right, and that investment on the education side, on the investment side, on the asset management side, then we're missing out on those new market opportunities. And I think that's really important, particularly where we are in this innovation economy, this technologically driven economy that we're in.
Right. You have all spoken about what a unique market opportunity this is, and to the people in the room who may be considering investing in this market opportunity. Yes. Miriam, what would you tell them is the most important thing to keep in mind when they do take advantage of this market opportunity?
So one of the things that we should realize is that the majority of Americans are now people of color, and they are Latino, they are African American, they are immigrants or children of immigrants. A quarter of the Gen Z population has some Latino descendancy. So we really need to understand that if we're going to reach these customers, we need to speak their languages and we need to know their cultures. And I think that when I was at Google, for example, one of the ways in which we were successful was the fact that when you were hired, you were asked, what languages do you speak, read, and write? Because guess what? We want to be localized in the language of every site that we have, and we want to reach the consumers in a way that feels comfortable to them, even to the level where, as an attorney, I was helping them localize Google.pr for Puerto Rico, where my family is from, because Spanish is not the same everywhere that speaks the language. So I think that is one of the things that we really need to keep in mind, is that if you want to succeed both in terms of reaching consumers and the American worker, you really have to understand who they are and make a comfortable environment for them to be productive for you as an employee as well as a customer.
So let's go down the line of how each of your organizations are actually doubling down on those kinds of efforts. Miriam, we stopped with you, so let's start with you.
Okay, so in terms of, for us, for example, one of the things that we are really focused on is just actually deploying capital in diverse communities. And so, as I mentioned, about half of our teams have a woman on the team. And frankly, our women-led companies are actually outperforming all other companies in our portfolio, including white males. And obviously, women can be people of color as well as women. And I think that our diverse teams are also just much greatly outperforming even our traditional teams. And that's not to say that our traditional teams aren't successful, but for a variety of reasons, they may be able to access capital more easily. They may be able to raise at higher valuations. And so the return on those investments will just be lower. The Kauffman Fellows Research Center, for example, indicates that just having diverse founders increases returns by 30%. And if you add diversity onto the C-suite, that will increase returns by 60%. So we're also trying to educate our founders on the value of diversity from an economic returns perspective.
Very good. So let us know what your shop is doing.
So Include is actually a holistic three-pronged strategy to make sure that new majority asset managers and founders are growing at scale over the next 10 years. Our goal is to make sure that at least 100 new emerging managers are growing through the life cycle of their firms, so from a fund 1, 2, 3, and beyond. We believe that will have a massive market reach to diverse and women-led fund founders as well. And so we've got our training and education program that's kind of churning out 10 to 15 fellows that are raising capital as we speak every year. We just graduated the first 10. We are also advising LPs and asset allocators on their strategies to double down on BIPOC firms like climate solution-focused funds and firms, as well as we're actually investing through Include Ventures in the best of our pipeline of over 500 fund managers. So have a lot to do in the next 10 years.
Sounds like it. Sounds like you've got a lot to do just in the next few months. And I'm sure you do as well, KJ.
Yeah, certainly trying to stay busy. So yeah, I guess I'll offer just a quick bit of context. So Foreigner is a VC fund that's looking to champion founders that are working or aiming to rescript culture, reimagine consumer-based experiences, particularly for this, I guess, contemporary, novel, digital age consumer. And so the efforts that we've taken as it relates to diversity is kind of what's been spoken about to this point, where it's an acknowledgement that the fabric of America, it looks a lot different now than it has historically, to the extent that our children of America, will know no ethnic majority, for example, right? And so when you take that into context and you work to effectively translate the notion of identity, who you are, what you do, how you kind of fit within a broader context or community, translate that notion into needs, those needs kind of surface different opportunities as it relates to businesses, both from an employee perspective, but also from a customer perspective. And so what we try to look into, what we try to lean into, is understanding those need states, identify those, and then match those with opportunities that work to satisfy those need states in ways that ultimately feel empowering or enriching. And so we back founders that are looking to champion that very notion, that ideal, because the expectations as it relates to one's identity and the ways that people need to show up in context for that has elevated to a pretty meaningful degree. And that creates alpha, that creates opportunity across a whole host of different dimensions. And that's what we as a firm try to lean into. And that's where we've identified like our mark within this broader ecosystem.
That's a unique perspective that you don't always hear about, needs-based. So can you tell us, the curveball here, can you tell us what's the most surprising thing that you might have learned in collecting these data?
Yeah. So our firm recently ran a survey in an attempt to understand the correlation or the relationship that exists between identity, affinity, and the ways that that shows up in consumer-based experiences. And I would say that there were two particularly interesting findings that I can kind of remark on now. The first of which had to do with the fact that as you consider the mosaic that contributes to someone's identity, right? Whether there's ethnicity, their interests, their hobbies, what we found and what we noted is that those pieces that felt underserved in any capacity were the ones that people had the strongest anchor to. It was what tethered them to their experiences, and is what created or sponsored a bridge that related them to others. And in that context, we also found that there are certain categories of kind of consumer-based experiences with which that tether, that anchor into what that underserved piece kind of shone most brightly. Specifically, it was family care, personal care, and health, for which your identity kind of mattered the most. And so what was interesting around these findings is that, well, one, that they exist, right? And some of these pieces may sound obvious, but to be able to kind of put data behind it was something that felt like a pretty significant step in order to kind of articulate what our value proposition was going to be, but also what types of opportunities made the most sense in delivering value for our end consumers. And so when you kind of combine those, you kind of like surface interesting opportunities, one of which, for example, was an investment that we made last year by the name of Alchemy, which is effectively a healthcare institution or platform for people of color. The idea was that being able to deliver competent, culturally competent care was what was needed in order to kind of combat the institutional issues or disparities that exist currently across health systems, with an idea of starting on mental health as like one of the more pressing needs facing the Black community. And so it's only with that perspective that you get to identify those types of opportunities that exist out in an ecosystem and kind of develop the conviction to kind of make those committed bets to making sure that those types of organizations, those types of companies, and what they stand for can be durable and long-lasting in the broader market.
Absolutely, and thanks for those examples too, because I think they really do help people to understand even more, just why it's important to include identity in the calculus. And so we have identity of consumers, and then we have identity of the American worker, right? And so let's talk about that, Miriam. How has the identity of the American worker changed, and how does it fit into this conversation we're having today?
I think one of the things that we've seen is that the US population has just changed demographically so intensely over the last 50 years, and that venture capital just really hasn't kept pace with that, where it's like 85% white male, and white and Asian male for the most part, and then very few people of color in there. And very few women. So you're basically having a population that's trying to serve markets that they don't represent and that they may not understand or even appreciate the size of. And one of the things that we know is that the millennial generation and the Gen Z generation are the most diverse generation in American history, and that they have a much broader range of sense of identity when it comes to things like gender, their cultural backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, and that they're much more accepting and welcoming, actually, of these things. And so we're just not responding to who is coming to work and who is actually buying our products.
Something else to think about. Now, you've heard how each individual organization is helping, but let's talk more solutions. And so, Bahia, I'm wondering what type of innovation is happening in the venture capital pipeline when it comes to ensuring VC funds go to diverse founders?
Well, again, our niche is women-led and new majority-led managers. What we're seeing externally is that there is, and we were talking about this at the beginning, a growing understanding of the need to invest at the manager level, and understanding that that's going to trickle down to diverse founders, whether specifically Black, Latinx. There's a lot of conversations that get into, well, are you a Black manager just investing in Black founders? I mean, from my perspective, the 30,000-foot perspective, it doesn't really matter, because we know that on par, they're going to, no matter what the diversity of the firm, they're going to just invest in more diverse founders. But I would say that allocators are starting to, and large corporations are starting to invest more in the managers. And so that's, to me, the most important thing, and the way that you actually, again, you scale kind of investment at the founder level.
But
so that's the end of, yeah.
I'm so sorry about that.
That's okay.
Thank you for explaining. One thing that I wanted to ask you about is the types of businesses. Do you see funds flowing more to earlier stage, smaller businesses, and why?
Yes, so that's a pipe. That's actually drills right down to the pipe, the correlation to the pipeline.
Yeah.
So because there's been such a juggernaut in investing into diverse founders over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, now that there's a flood of investment, actually a trickle. Let's just make it, let's be clear, not a flood. But now that there's a trickle of investment into the managers that are ready to deploy capital, a lot of the diverse founders are actually still early stage. They're pre-seed, late seed, even Series A. I mean, Miriam can speak to pipeline of there are very few diverse founders that have gone past a Series B, C, D. I mean, it's like thin air, right? And so the reason why there's a little bit of a juggernaut in those investments is that most more traditional and more white shoe investment firms want to invest in later stage, want to invest in private equity, want to invest in more robust businesses. But again, that pipeline has kind of been marginalized a bit. And so this is the first wave, right, of investment into the managers that are investing in the early stage, and we'll see in the next 10 years, which is why that scale is so important, those later stage companies start to mature and starting to exit.
And may I add something?
Sure, go ahead.
So one of the things that I think people don't realize is how little the numbers really are. So when we looked at the data between 2015 and 2020, we realized that in the United States, there had been fewer than 100 investments in companies that were led by African American and Latino founders. That's in our entire nation. And now that there's a flood of capital, that has increased to 200.
200, okay.
In the entire United States. And then when we think about women, for example, who've raised, women of color who've raised capital, it's probably under 100 in the country.
Yeah.
So we're really in the early days of access to capital for diverse people in this nation. And venture capital is one way that we want to get capital in different hands. And I also want to just amplify the work of other folks that are looking at revenue-based venture capital and new approaches to get capital in the hands of diverse people, because the small businesses of this country are really a huge potential source of well-being for everyone. So Stanford Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative, for example, says that if we could raise Latino small business to just the size of the average white business, that would be a $2 trillion impact on the US economy. Yeah. So we really need to get capital in different forms to different entrepreneurs.
That makes me think about what Arlen Hamilton is doing with Backstage Capital. Mm-hmm. And it's more of a crowdfunding approach that way. And I would, suggest you guys just look around at which other ways people are getting capital, because as you say, these things are going to need to rise to the top. So folks, we're actually going to come to a close, but not before we get a call to action. We have to end on a call to action because all of you came here for that after all. And so tell me something. KJ, let's start with you. Yep. What can the executives here and who are watching online do to help further these efforts?
Yeah, I mean, it starts with intentionality, which is not something to be ignored or diminished. I think intentionality is extremely important, and then it creates a dynamic in which you can just work backwards. Start for where your intentions are, start with what you want to accomplish from a goal-setting perspective, and then figure out the baby steps, if you will, the lily pads that you can jump across to get to the other side of the lake that gets you from where you want to be from where you are. I think that intentionality component is particularly important, and I think that should be the North Star as you think about any type of initiatives, any types of plans, and making sure that anything that you put forward actually works to serve to move the needle.
All right, on to you, Bahia.
Sure. Well, include our franchise, our training nonprofit, our investment firm. Our advisory firm is here to work with whomever is ready to continue to invest in the next generation of alpha generators, like Miriam and KJ's firm. There are hundreds of them, and they are all, doing incredible work and sourcing and selecting founders in particular regions, both in the U.S. and abroad. And so we're here to help, and we're here to accelerate and amplify the process. So we're excited to partner with those. I talk about a coalition of the willing. That's what we're building here at Include.
All right, and Miriam, you have the last word for today.
So one is, if you're investing in, you have an endowment and you're investing those endowments, make sure that you actually are investing in women and people of color in your pipelines, and change your policies if you aren't able to. For example, some will say we don't invest in firms that have under $300 million in assets under management, and they may as well just say we don't invest in Black people, Latinos, or women. So, I've seen many foundations, for example, change their policies to change that. The other thing is, in your own organizations, invest in your people. We see women are not promoted at the same rate as men, regardless of their experience. We also need to pay them equally. And then in addition, I think we need to have more family-friendly workforce so that we can actually keep women and people of color in corporate America and get some of the training that they need to be able to successfully run their own businesses.
All right, I think that is a brilliant place to leave it. So KJ, Bahia, Miriam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And to all of you, at this time, we're going to have a 30-minute networking break, and the program will restart shortly. So enjoy yourselves, and we'll see you out there. Thanks a lot.
The fact is that millions of Negroes, as a result of centuries of denial and neglect, been left bootless. It is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps.
At the dawn of emancipation, the total black wealth in America was about 0.5%. Today, that number is between 1% to 2%. So there has been practically no movement.
I mean, the most pernicious form of the racial wealth gap is when we take people, human beings, as capital for others, as being an asset by which others can be enriched, can accumulate, can pass down resources from one generation to the other.
They find themselves impoverished aliens in this affluent society. And that is a great deal that the society can and must do if the Negro is to gain the economic security that he needs.
The origins of the racial wealth gap begins when black people entered the shores of the United States as chattel capital. There were two forms in which black people served as capital. The uncompensated labor that they provided, but their sheer bodies themselves could be traded and stood as a source of wealth and wealth building for white people.
The enslavement of black people in America is what made the US economy grow into the powerhouse that it is today. Even though most of this farming activity was going on in the southern part of the United States, businesses all over the country were involved in this. Insurance companies insured the slaves themselves. There were even slave-backed securities that could be traded by financial institutions. In essence, slavery encompassed nearly every part of the US economy at this point. At the start of the Civil War, each slave was worth an average of $1,000. That came to $4 billion at that point because there were around 4 million slaves in the US. In today's money, that comes to $42 trillion. And $42 trillion is about double the size of the current US economy.
With the 13th Amendment that freed slaves, the point is that that's not enough. When you've had centuries of literally bondage imposed upon a people, if you want true justice or true freedom, there needed to be not only that freedom from bondage, but actual accompanying of resources so that people could pursue their livelihood. Expecting a people to thrive and flourish without compensation for all that unjust harm really just set up a system for oppression and a system that was unjust.
Toward the end of the Civil War, General William Tecumseh Sherman made a promise to slaves that as soon as the war was over, they would be granted 40 acres of land and a mule. This idea of giving land had a dual purpose. People that supported it saw it as a way to both free the formerly enslaved from their old masters and as a way to dilute the power of these Southern landowners. But a few months later, President Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed. His vice president, Johnson, swiftly got rid of this promise.
When Andrew Johnson vetoed the Freedmen's Bill, he said, look, this is a white man's government. So that was the impetus. But also use this idea that the government doesn't give away land, this is capitalism. And the idea that this is a free market and laissez-faire was very much used to undercut claims of the 40 acres, while at the same time, the government is giving away free land out west through the Homestead Act.
The Homestead Acts were a series of bills meant to encourage settlement of the American West. In all, 270 million acres were given out as part of the bills. That land, which accounts for about 10% of the entire country, was mostly stolen from Native Americans, and most of the 1.5 million Americans that benefited from the Homestead Acts were white.
They were literally giveaways that provided white people ultimately a key ingredient to build wealth, and that's capital itself. And by design, black people were not included. The Homestead Act is a dramatic indicator of U.S. government facilitating the accumulation for white people and not facilitating it for black people, but it's one of many. The Homestead Act fits into a larger context that throughout our United States history, well beyond slavery. You know, we think about racial repression and we think that with emancipation, that all of a sudden we were a free country. But a bigger point to make is that if we think about a middle class, a middle white asset building class, it was government policy that generated it.
What little economic successes black people were able to have at this time often spurred a lot of resentment among whites. This led to thousands of lynchings of black people and other violent attacks, sometimes on entire black neighborhoods and communities.
My name is Roy Wood, and I'm not ashamed to be a Klansman. Amen.
This was in the time of heavy Jim Crow, in the time of, rising Klan, and in the time where white supremacy was gaining this pseudo-scientific legitimacy.
It is the case that throughout history, not only have blacks not been permitted to accumulate land, capital, and other forms of resource to the same extent as whites, but when they were able to overcome barriers and accumulate those resources, it's always been subject to outright terror, outright seizure, because we did not have the codification that comes along with government to protect the resources of black people in the same way that it was protected for white people.
Tulsa, for example, in the 1900s, it was an oil boom with a lot of wealth that was in that community. And so they built, the Greenwood district, and the central part of the city was this black church. It was very ornate, beautiful. These places are called the Black Wall Street, where it wasn't a sharecropping market. There were land holdings. The thing that happened was that the racial resentment grew. There were, bombings and really just a complete destruction of that city, and very much stemming from that resentment.
In that one day, Black Wall Street was destroyed and 10,000 Tulsans were displaced. There's even evidence that World War I bomber planes were used to burn the town. In Tulsa alone, the property damage amounts to about $200 million in today's money. The Tulsa massacre was not an isolated incident. About 100 of these occurred between the end of the Civil War and the 1940s, destroying a substantial amount of black wealth.
On the one hand, those communities are clear examples of the ways in which black people have demonstrated they can not only survive, but it can actually thrive. But on the other hand, we romanticize the past. We describe a nostalgia as if we had these kingdoms of gold, when in reality, it was never the case that black people had wealth en masse. That said, left to our own druthers, the wealth gap is not going to be solved.
Slavery itself created a multi-trillion-dollar wealth gap, and the period immediately following slavery didn't do anything to close it. And none of that includes the one thing that most people today can trace their wealth back to: home ownership. Following the Great Depression, Congress passed a series of laws to help the country recover from the economic crisis. Among them was the 1934 National Housing Act. This law, for the first time, made home ownership affordable to working class individuals.
And that was a good thing, except for the fact that it intentionally excluded black people. The mortgage companies did not lend to black people. In fact, the federal government went the other way. Federal government as well as local governments, they facilitated the process of excluding black people from these products. And how did they do so? Neighborhoods were redlined.
The government created maps that showed the level of risk by neighborhood. These had different colors, and the riskiest was outlined in red.
This was very much a crude calculus, but sophisticated in a way that they actually had tons of maps across the country. And you would see the way that they mapped out a neighborhood, and they looked at the houses. Is it single family? Is it industrial? Is it farmland? What are the characteristics of the neighborhood? But the number one thing that they looked at is who lives there, right? So they would say, this is a black neighborhood, red line.
And naturally, what would develop? Slums. What would develop? Neighborhood degradation. When you have capital fleeing certain areas and capital being flooded into areas, the outcomes become obvious.
If you lived in a black neighborhood, and because it was a black neighborhood, you did not get that FHA mortgage, you did not get that GI Bill loan, you did not get the farm loans. So today, the legacy of those laws is that your neighborhood is very much racially coded. This is how racism gets embedded in wealth.
Word came from Capitol Hill that Congress had passed and sent to the White House the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Included in the measure was a landmark open housing bill.
Recessions usually mean job losses. And when a recession begins to end, we typically see jobs start to open up again. After all, that's what happened after the Great Recession in 2008. Notably, women made up a large percentage of those who entered the workforce during that economic recovery period.
After the Great Financial Crisis in 2008, because family finances were so strained, a lot of women entered the workforce to support their families when they hadn't been doing so before. And at the same time, we had a really, really strong labor market, which allowed women to enter who hadn't been doing so. Up until early 2020, women were making gains for, the prior 5 years.
Women's labor force participation had been growing over the past 60 years. In fact, things were going so well that in January 2020, 2 months before the coronavirus pandemic shut down the U.S., women had outpaced men as the majority of the workforce for the first time in a decade.
And this is a really good thing because this is the future of the workforce. We are increasingly becoming a services-oriented economy.
But all of that progress is wiped out when the pandemic forced everyone home, disproportionately affecting women around the world.
More than 12 million women lost their jobs during the pandemic, and over 4.5 million have not returned to the workforce.
The impact of COVID is so severe that it set the rate of U.S. female workforce participation back more than 30 years, to the same rate it was in April 1987. So while the 2008 recession recovery may have worked out for many women, this time, women are finding themselves burnt out from juggling unemployment or working full-time remotely with domestic roles. Many have even decided to give up their careers entirely to tend to at-home unpaid labor and their own personal health.
The burden of caregiving, with schools and daycare still not fully open in some parts of the country, is an added burden, especially on mothers.
So as businesses reopen and employers are hiring again, many women aren't necessarily coming back, in a crisis that some economists are calling the first female recession.
Out in California, 2 of the best mechanics working on Link trainer planes are women.
It used to be during recessions that women actually entered the workforce to take care of their families. We saw the same after World War II. And so this was a really unique situation in that rather than joining the workforce to support their families, they left the workforce to support their families.
According to data from McKinsey, more than double the number of mothers found themselves taking on an additional 5 hours of daily domestic work compared to their male counterparts. Much of this can be attributed to gender norms across societies, with women bearing more of the burden at home.
We know that when there's a crisis at home, whether that's a pandemic or a family crisis or a crisis with a child themselves, it's often women that are the ones to
take on that care. And so when we had these school closures and daycare closures, it naturally was women that left the workforce at a faster pace.
What's different about this particular recession is that it also affected women across all pay levels, from minimum wage workers to high-level executives.
I spoke with a woman for some of my reporting who was a top executive at Facebook who left her job for childcare. When you're at such a high executive role like that, you can't just go and start working at a bar, which is really where the jobs are open. And when you have a competitive resume, it takes more time to re-enter. And so she was expecting it could take up to 6 months or more to kind of get the role that she was looking for.
Other women who chose to stay in the workforce say they were barely hanging on while balancing multiple full-time roles. Reshma Saljani is the CEO of the organization Girls Who Code. At the height of the pandemic, she found herself overwhelmed with juggling household chores, caring for her sons, and working on her nonprofit remotely.
I was doing the homeschooling while I was running my organization. In between, I was doing the laundry, you know what I mean, doing the dishes, right, ordering whatever I needed on Amazon. And so by the end of the day, I was just done. You know, I got COVID and it barely registered. You know, my liver failed. I had acne on my face as if I was like 16 years old, and it wasn't just me.
In response to the pandemic, Reshma is proposing a Marshall Plan to better support working moms, including wage equity, paid family leave, and work retraining programs for when women return from maternity leave.
So, you know, moms are not America's social safety net. We're one of the few countries that doesn't offer a paternity allowance. That's come today in the form of a child tax credit.
Today, the expanded child tax credit is here.
But that was a revolutionary idea that's been met with a tremendous amount of resistance.
As a mother, a single mother, like, you need to be there for everything for your child. I was working at 311. I got a call. It was like an emergency call. And my supervisor, like, you can't use your phone. So if people need you, they have to call like the office, and you would get connected through your supervisor. My child ended up at the hospital, and I'm in the middle of the floor. I heard Dad's answering the phone. I'm instantly devastated, but I'm also embarrassed, frustrated, aggravated that I had to get this phone call like this in front of this woman standing here in the midst of everybody. I ended up losing the job because when you're out, you have to call in and tell them kind of what's going on or the reason for your being out. And at that time, I couldn't even talk without crying. That really kind of threw me off as a person.
Burnout isn't just something that happens at work. It's something that happens when you're, you know, a domestic childcare provider. And so if you're trying to do both of those things, people's mental health suffers.
This stress has compounded during the pandemic, with one piece of research stating that working women have reported increased levels of depression by 83% compared to 36% of working men. Crucially, this can impact a woman's ability to progress in her career. And when women are underrepresented at work, companies are less incentivized to provide them the support they need.
Women do a tremendous amount of unpaid labor. Almost 86% of the household chores and the child care rearing is done by women. And so you simply can't raise your hand for that promotion. You can't start that business. You can't take on that nursing degree that you've always dreamed about because you have so much happening at home. And this is why we have enormous levels of poverty when it comes to women of color, because they're in low-paying jobs and they're not getting the support that they need, you know, to thrive.
So I lost my job, stopped paying rent. We went to live in the shelter. One of the things that I did with a lot of my free time was volunteer at church. We wanted to show the scriptures. Like, so if people didn't have their Bible, they could just look up on the screen. I figured out what device to use and what program to run it. I had some help, but a lot of it is me running it and doing it and implementing it. One of my friends, she saw that I had a good hold to technology.
On her friend's recommendation, Tanya soon applies and gets accepted into a coding boot camp.
It's a program where you don't pay up front, but it's also like an unpaid thing. So there was no income coming from there. So I'm in pursuit, struggling.
Things are moving very, very quickly when it comes to the coronavirus. I'm stating the obvious to everyone here.
COVID hits. I had to shift my whole life to make sure that I supported and covered my children. I have to leave early every day from class. I could get my daughter and so that she could go into the shelter. We're told to stay indoors, stay in place, but I couldn't. I couldn't because I still needed to do the classes and I was having issues with the Wi-Fi they gave me. So I would go to my church.
I think the thing that broke so many of us, and it still breaks me now, is it didn't seem like anybody cared. It didn't seem like anybody was saying, gosh, the moms, what are we going to do? Because this country doesn't function without us. But we just kind of ate it up and kept going.
Still, many women found themselves without any other options but to persevere.
I had a lot of outside stressors. There's a lot of assignments that I wasn't able to complete. I get through the program at Pursuit. I'm able to move on to the next steps with my fellow students in the class. And I'm not found job ready, but I still started applying to jobs just like everybody else. One of the alumni posted a job position. I applied. I got hired at the Not Worldwide. When I got the job, I was crying. My boss, nobody knew my situation. I didn't tell them, that's not something you tell people when you're interviewing. No, you're just gonna see confidence and competence. That's all you're gonna see.
While Tanya found success in the end, this isn't always the case for other working moms struggling to find their work-life balance. And there's still plenty to be done from both the private and public sectors to better support working women.
And then we ask ourselves, why do we have a declining birth rate? Well, the reality is it's too expensive to have kids. And so it's not that people don't want to have them, it's that they can't. A lot of companies pride themselves on offering, paid parental leave. Some of these companies offer mom 6 months, dad 3 months. Why? Or when you're a guy and you actually take the parental leave, it's frowned upon.
We've seen companies like LinkedIn and other tech companies kind of offering alternative childcare. Last summer, for example, some companies offered summer camps. And then in the public sector, we've seen Biden making a big push for what we call soft infrastructure, which would be universal childcare for children's ages 3 and 4, as well as childcare subsidies for those from 0 to 5.
The current child tax credit that was passed during the pandemic offers families up to $300 in monthly payments per child. As part of her Marshall Plan for Moms proposal, Reshma is calling for these credits to be extended indefinitely.
Please take your seats. The program will begin in 5 minutes.
Passing paid leave once for all. The second piece is really working, on the private sector and making sure that we build a work environment that works for parents, offering parental leave, offering flexibility, finally getting equal pay for equal work.
With so many things going on, we have to choose our children over our jobs. We're capable, and if we're paid enough for the value that we do bring, we can actually be able to do a bit more.
Even as Congress makes moves towards financial assistance for working mothers, there are also many other issues preventing women from fully returning to work in person, from sexual discrimination to harassment to microaggression at the workplace.
And then it's the men who have FaceTime with their bosses and are getting the promotions. And
Please take your seats. The program is about to begin.
Belonging. It does require addressing systems, and that takes money.
COVID has given us this opportunity to look at our society and say, you know what? I want to build it back better, right? This is broken, and it is okay to acknowledge it. It's not just for moms, but it's for dads. It's for millennials who don't want to have kids. It's for everybody to be like, we are actually going to redesign the workplace so that it works for us. And we have to recognize that we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do that.
So while financial help and flexible work accommodations can be helpful in supporting the female workforce, the solution really begins at home on a societal level.
When we still have inequality at home, we're never going to have equality in the workplace. We didn't go through hell and back to say exactly where we're at when this started. Let's use this opportunity to fix things for once. Let's finish this fight, once and for all.
Please welcome to the stage Bloomberg LP, Head of Diversity and Inclusion for the Americas, Fatima A. Shama.
Hi. Welcome back from your break. I hope you all had a chance to refill. It's amazing to see people in person. I'm still not sure I'm used to it. I think I'm sort of getting adjusted to the reality that, like, it's okay, right? I'm still not so sure I'm used to it on the train. That's a different conversation. So good morning. It's lovely to see you all. I'm Fatima, and I have the extraordinary pleasure of serving as Bloomberg's head of diversity and inclusion for North and South America. And so for those of you that are, I'm actually still new in this role, I think, new, since October. It's been an incredible conversation, but like today, really an opportunity to continue the critical conversations we all need to be having, to be quite frank and honest. I want to really give a shout out to my colleague Shartia Brantley, who is an extraordinary colleague in helping welcome me to Bloomberg, but also has put together this extraordinary couple of days. Thank you. I think this opportunity of this conversation is what I think some of us might call the responsibility for real talk. And so as you continue to listen and learn, whether it's today or tomorrow, I want to encourage both you and me to think, how do we do this differently? This is an important time for this conversation. Quite frankly, it's so overdue, and many of us are simply exhausted that we're still having this conversation. I love to remind people, like, it's 2022, friends. Are we still here? And the answer is, yeah, right? We're still here, right? And although funny, it's actually not so funny. We're living through and coming out of a global pandemic. It's demonstrated so much to all of us, and likely for all of you in the work that you're doing. Every day we're managing through protecting the health of our employees, realizing what this chapter has meant for your consumers, for your customers. We're seeing disparities at rates that remind us yet again, equity and equality is still far from near. And the underlying racial and social justice reawakening that we have seen is yet another reminder of what needs to happen. And across the pond, in Europe, we're witnessing, once again, the demise of society, of a society in particular. Much has been written about all of this, many by amazing Bloomberg journalists that are here today and having this conversation with you. The reality and understanding of how things have shifted for us in what is now recognized as our new normal, whether as professionals or as caretakers, means that there is change and opportunity in our sectors and in our workplace. We're witnessing the realities of a great resignation alongside an incredible hiring frenzy and what, quote, is being called a war for talent. Yet for women and for people of color and those of us who identify as the minority in our spaces, the reality of this chapter has disproportionately affected us. Likely, no surprise to anyone here, time and again, women and children are the unintended victims and put at greater disadvantage, whether in this global health crisis or again in global conflict. What does this mean? What does it mean for you, for us, for Bloomberg? The evidence is there. So I'm going to share some data points, likely data points you've heard already echoed on this stage, but that will come up again and again. Diversity and inclusion builds a better workforce, yields higher revenue, boosts employee satisfaction. The business case demonstrates time and again that D&I can make you better. For diverse companies, the likelihood of outperforming industry peers on profitability has increased over time, and quite frankly, we're starting to see that if you're not focused in that area, you might struggle and suffer. Gender diverse companies are 15 times more likely to beat industry median financial returns. McKinsey does a lot of great research on this work. Their analysis shows that companies that have gender diversity on their executive teams are 25% more likely to experience above average profitability than their peers in the fourth quartile. Women are expected to make up 47.2% of the workforce by 2024, Yet, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we're still not paid the equivalents of our male colleagues. As of June 2021, 41 Fortune 500 companies, just 8%, were helmed by women, and only 2 by Black women. Only 1 major US bank has a woman chief executive. So with all of the data there, we're still seeing this reality. Diverse management boosts revenue by 19%. McKinsey's research shows again that the representation of ethnic minorities, both in the US and in UK executive teams, has grown from 2014 to 2019, yet despite the signs of progress, we're still greatly underrepresented among the corporate decision makers. In June 2021, Black Americans, who account for 13% of the US population, on average held just 5% of manager positions in the 80 Fortune 500 companies for which the data was available. Similarly, for Hispanics and Latinos, who account for 18.4% of the population, they held just 6% of manager positions. And if we reflect on the workforce today, and you ask them, so if you're surveying the people who work for you, they're telling you more than 3 out of 4 workers prefer diverse companies. According to a 2020 Glassdoor survey, Glassdoor, for whatever it's worth, I recognize, having myself found our company listed on it, 76% of job seekers and employees polled said a diverse workforce was an important factor for them when evaluating job opportunities in companies. 80% of workers want inclusive companies. And just before, one of the panelists talked about the reality of who our workforce is today. The reality of our workforce is, in fact, a diverse workforce, right? When folks talk to me about, well, we need to recruit a diverse workforce, I'm like, you need to recruit today's workforce. Let's stop making us unicorns in this space. We're here. You want to employ us, recognize who we are, welcome us in the space, ensure that we can be part of the fabric. D&I is no longer over there. D&I needs to be here. And so I ask you all, in recognition that 48% of Gen Zers coming into our doors identify as racially or ethnically diverse, they are our workforce today and tomorrow. This conversation can't be one that isn't real. So you've already heard data from me. You're going to hear it from others. You're going to hear echoing of this reality. For me and for Bloomberg, we have a lot of work to do. I say that recognizing that we are hosting this brilliant conversation, but there is a lot of room for growth. And the work to be done can only get better. I'm a believer that leadership matters. So as we lead in bringing all of you together to have this critical conversation, I'm eager to partner with you, elevate our work, elevate our voice, and more. But more importantly, I ask that you be partners in that work. So for all of us, I ask that you consider what and how you can take what you've heard today and push yourselves and your enterprises to do more. Continue to lead. As someone who has spent most of my career working for the breadth and the beauty of our young people and their promise and potential, I ask that we all take them into recognition and understanding. The ownership of this moment can't be understated. So when we lead, we actually can realize racial equity and the celebration of our diversity, and quite frankly, create inclusive communities where people can thrive, not just in our companies, but in our communities. And so enjoy the rest of this incredible conversation. I look forward to meeting you and seeing you, and thank you for being here. Be well.
Please welcome to the stage New York Life Investment Management, LLC CEO Yishin Hung and Bloomberg's Scarlet Fu.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you to Fatima for giving us the data and showcasing why it's important to have female leaders like Yishin with us today. Female CEOs, we know, are a pretty rare breed. They make up about 5 to 6% of the S&P 500 or Fortune 500 companies. Female CEOs in the financial services industry are like unicorns. I mean, impossible to find. Fatima mentioned the one lone female CEO of a bank, Jane Fraser. We see that asset management firms, there seems to be a little bit more female representation. You've got Abigail Johnson at Fidelity, Jenny Johnson at Franklin Templeton. You are at New York Life Investment Management. Why do you think this is?
You know, I think it just reflects the evolution of the finance industry over time. You know, we're at a point now where I think there's been so much focus on improving the diversity of those coming into the industry, but it takes a while for that class to make it to a level where they can be in senior positions. And I'm encouraged by what I see in terms of the increasingly diverse, increasingly female population. But what's important for all of us is to make sure that those individuals and that representation continue as they move up. And having been CEO now for a few years, I have a couple of thoughts on this in terms of how we can ensure that happens. I think number one, when you think about women, they oftentimes are a little bit less noisy when it comes to what is their next career step.
Less self-promotional.
Exactly. And it's easy to assume that they're comfortable with the role that they're in, that they're not as ambitious as the men, but that's not a safe assumption. Secondly, women tend to want to satisfy every single criteria for that next position. Right? We know through research men don't necessarily hold themselves to that. And so we have to. If they're not willing to raise their hand, we raise their hand for them. And then lastly, I think this is where research also shows that women don't oftentimes realize just how important sponsors are for them in order to get that next opportunity. And so as a result, women, and especially women of color, get further behind in their career relative to men.
So you mentioned that you've held the top job at New York Life for almost 7 years now, since 2015. You've been with the firm for 11 years. During that time, you oversaw a fourfold increase in assets under management. Being CEO is not a job that someone stumbles into. You've done incredibly well. At what point in your 36-year career in finance did you realize that you were kind of laying the groundwork for becoming a CEO?
You know, it's interesting, Scarlett, I really didn't think about becoming a CEO.
You stumbled into it?
I sort of stumbled into it. You know, and I think you have to take a step back with me. You know, I'm the product of immigrant parents, and I have a lot of that spirit within me, in the sense of feeling like it was up to me to sort of figure things out along the way. I should be the one that adjusts and adapts and fit in. Mm-hmm. And so once I ended up in finance, I really didn't have the benefit of a lot of people around me to advise me. So more or less I would look around and I'd see different people, a couple steps ahead of me, and I'd say, okay, that's interesting. And that's what happened in business school. My next door neighbor was this very accomplished analyst from a Wall Street bank, and I thought she held herself up so well. I wanted to be that, and that's what led me into investing.
So you modeled yourself after people that you thought, I'd like to see what they've got going on. I want to try this out.
Exactly.
So you did not exactly plot out a career in finance. So you studied engineering. What kind?
Mechanical.
Mechanical. And then you ended up working in finance. How did you make that transition, aside from the math skills, which probably makes finance look easy compared to engineering?
Yeah. It's true. So I guess I was fortunate because I ended up having a number of internships as an engineer, and I kept wondering more about what the companies were all about, their strategy, their approach, rather than the products that I was building. And so when I had the chance to really go to business school and embark on that road, I just said, I might as well just go do that. And what has been helpful for me, I think, is the analytical skills that I developed. And, it's a business, it's constantly changing, so it's important to be curious and really enjoy learning. And all of those pieces, the sort of problem solving that I so enjoy, really has benefited me.
So your first job in finance was at Dean Witter, which was, of course, later taken over by Morgan Stanley. You started in investment banking, focusing on real estate and really complicated legal transactions, doing the math on it, using your hardcore engineering math skills. That was fairly easy in finance. You stayed with it even after Morgan Stanley bought out Dean Witter in investment banking. But at what point did you realize, there's more to finance than just investment banking, making pitch books?
I ended up at doing real estate investment banking, as you said, and I really did enjoy it. But there came a point in time where, even it's today, right? Tech is really taking over bricks and mortar. And so I found myself in a group that just didn't have the revenue volume. I was looking for that next promotion, and it was really hard to come by. And I was very fortunate because I had a boss that I'd known for a long time, and not only did he sit me down and say, chances aren't great here, but I'll also help you find another opportunity. And that led me into this role that was intersection between business and technology. It was a tough decision because I remember for the first 6 months, I didn't understand anything anybody was saying. And then I woke up one day and I sort of got it. But it set me on this path where almost every 2 to 3 years, I had a different position, different role, different company. And I learned to put myself and get comfortable with being outside my comfort zone.
Was that deliberate, by the way, the every 2 years cadence?
It was not, really. I think, again, it's a little bit of a theme, in terms of seeing where the opportunities might be, how can I round out my skill set. And so sometimes I was asked, other times I felt like I had to do this next opportunity. But in hindsight, I think to your point, it was the best training possible for becoming CEO.
Yeah, to expose you to all different parts of the bank. You mentioned that you're in real estate and you wanted to move into technology, which is more revenue generating. It's clearly the hot area. Why is it that women seem to be in finance more ensconced in things like retail and utilities and less of the exciting high growth areas like technology?
I think there's a lot of aspects of finance that can be intimidating. And I think we all have an opportunity to change that profile. When I think about what we do in investment management, it has a lot of purpose, a lot of good, helping people achieve their financial aspirations. And so I think there is a tendency to shy away from that, even though women are as capable, right, in these areas as men. And I think that's really what happens over the course of time. But again, I think it's important, if I reflect on my own career, it has been those opportunities that have just been, a little bit off the main beaten path. And I've learned and built confidence over time that regardless of the situation, I'll figure it out.
So then you pivoted to investment management, and that was not deliberate either. You kind of went into it as a chief of staff to someone who was in the business. Is that right? Can you explain how that transpired?
Sure. So again, I think I ended up in this intersection of business, banking, and technology, and it had sort of run its course. And so I needed to figure out my next move. And fortunately, the gentleman that was running the asset management business was somebody that was previously my boss's boss's boss, and I must have left somewhat of a good impression because when I came knocking on his door, he needed a chief of staff. And everything worked out. At the time, it was a little bit of a step back in terms of pay and the like, but it was again, in hindsight, it was such a good move. And it shows, I think, the value of relationships, to my point earlier of making sure you have a strong community and then taking a chance.
So that's really interesting that at the time it was a little bit of a step back. Did that give you pause? Like, I have to keep moving forward. I can't afford to take a step back because that might set me off on a different trajectory.
I ended up really thinking about this from the standpoint, once I left banking, which was a very well-established path, I found as I kept making these moves that I learned more and more about myself, what I enjoyed, what I was good at, what I didn't like. And so I viewed that opportunity as just another way to see, is this an industry I like? Is there more that I want to do? And again, I am so grateful that I had that because that's led me to where I am today.
And then in the middle of the subprime crisis, before the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, you went over to Bridgewater, which is the asset management firm that's run by Ray Dalio. You focused on acquisitions there?
I did not. I actually focused on just general management and focusing around bringing on talent into the organization.
Okay, so you're steeped in that culture, principles, all of that. You made a transition to New York Life. Were you looking for this specific opportunity to go into an investment management company, in a life insurance company, or did it kind of land in your lap? Were you deliberately looking for this kind of firm?
I was looking for an opportunity to have impact in terms of the skills that I had acquired over time to really build a business. And I was introduced to New York Life through a family friend, and at the time, they were really focused on growing this business, and I saw all the perfect ingredients for growing it. Here you have a long-standing institution that's been around 175 years, essentially private, enormous amount of capital, long-term perspective, and a great environment, and set of values and culture that really align with mine. So,
what was it about the values and culture that
I really
captured your
appreciated?
attention? Yeah.
Well, first and foremost, I think it is a company that's very focused on being there for their clients whenever they need them and having this long-term perspective. It's a culture that I would describe as a we place, not a me place, which very much fits with who I am. And I also saw a real sincerity in terms of commitment to diversity and creating opportunities. And I think I'm such a prime example of that. And so all of those elements I found really attractive.
So as Asian women, we confront issues of race and gender. There's also issues of age. And I'm curious because I know early in my career, I looked young, and there was a lot of conversations with my managers where it's like, oh, you're too young to be taken seriously, or why would you want that? You can wait a few years. Did you experience that as well? And if so, how did you navigate that?
I can completely relate. I think I told you, I couldn't wait to have wrinkles and gray hair.
That's a first.
Is that crazy? You know, so people would take me seriously. You know, it again comes from that mindset of, look, you know, if it takes me a little bit longer or if I have to wait a little more, so be it. You know, at least I'm in the game. Mm-hmm. And I think that patience and that sort of willingness to sort of just bite it out, I think has paid off.
Right, and we talked about this earlier about how also as an Asian, there's this culture of respecting your elders, of making space for them, listening to them, heeding and almost not submitting to their requests, but giving them the space and the priority. Did that hold you back at all in any way as you continued to rise in your career? Did you have to change your thinking on that?
I did. I think as you're referring to, it's sort of speak when you're spoken to.
Yes.
Right. You know, let those with more experience take the floor first. That was something that was a real hard transition for me, where I just had to force myself to speak up and just forget about how perfect that was and just keep doing it over and over again. And even today, you know, I think about this dinner I attended last week with a number of very prominent CEOs, and I found myself really reticent to say something unless I was asked a question. And I realized some of this is ingrained, but the more that you're aware of those, the more that you can sort of force yourself to go beyond it.
Yeah, and especially when you're in a group that isn't women, isn't Asians, or isn't in your industry, you're kind of out of your comfort zone, right? How often do you have to remind yourself of these things, even as a CEO of a massive investment management company?
A little bit less today than when I was younger, but it's still there. And I view myself still as a work in progress, as I'm sure all of us do. And I think that's a really important mindset, because then you don't hold yourself to, I have to be perfect at this. Because the more we do it, the better we get at it.
So there's this book called Undiversified, I should say, by Katrina Dudley and Ellen Carr, which really explores the issues on why there's gender imbalance in the investment management industry. And you've come out of this as well. And they identify all kinds of issues with the pipeline, with risk-taking, which is reflected in the pay structure, where sometimes often women are more comfortable with a flat pay than commission pay. The importance of networking. Let's talk about networking here. You mentioned mentors, and I think in all the instances, they were men as well. Did you seek out male mentors? Were there female mentors available to you if you wanted one?
Less so, I would say. I mean, there were a few women along the way that I really valued, you know, in terms of people I looked up to. But by virtue of when I entered the industry, it was mostly dominated by men. But they were very helpful to me. And it started with my dad, who was just an incredible supporter of mine, thought that I could do whatever I wanted to put my mind to. And then to the manager that I mentioned, when I was running up against the promotion wall, him having not only just leveling with me, but also opening a door for me. And I even remember earlier than that, he used to say to people, anytime I have a really tough problem, I bring it to Yishin. And I think back about that too, because, you know, people in positions of power and influence, we need them to help lend some of that to all of us, to give us the opportunity, the credibility, the chance to have that next step. And that's really what I think about when I think about sponsors. And it has to be a two-way street also. I think one of the things I realized sort of midway in my career is focusing on what they're trying to accomplish. And if I can help them accomplish that, and I do that multiple times over, it does ultimately pay back.
Well, now that you're CEO, how do you create an environment where there can be male sponsors for younger women? And I bring this up because after Me Too, there are a lot of stories about how senior male executives were reluctant to mentor a younger woman because they didn't want to be in a position where there could be misinterpretation of any kind. And so they felt it was just safer not to mentor a younger woman. How do you create the space for that? How do you lead the company to a place where it's okay to do that and everyone feels comfortable with it?
No, I think we have to recognize these last 2 years have been one of incredible amount of change, right? This global pandemic, a racial reckoning, this terrible crisis that we're seeing unfold in Ukraine. This is a time where leadership has to show up differently in the sense of being much more empathetic, much more inclusive, and meeting people where they are. And I say that because as much as perhaps men might feel uncomfortable, I think all of us feel uncomfortable. We need to be having these conversations. At New York Life 5-6 years ago, we commissioned a study to better understand racial relations in the workplace. And one of the greatest insights we found is that for all of us in this room and across this country, typically our most diverse workplaces is in the office. It used to be race was there with politics and religion, but we have to bring it in because given the emotional nature of everything we've been through, we cannot ask people to park their emotions at the front door before they come in. So it's a long-winded answer, but I would say that we have to really lean on our colleagues in talent management and HR. They're wonderful unconscious bias programs. We've had candid conversations about race, creating space for that. And recognizing that if, you know, a one-on-one situation doesn't feel comfortable, there's no reason why you can't have a group conversation, but these are conversations that need to happen if we're going to make progress in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and you could do it in a public place perhaps where doors are not closed and people can see you. Fatima just mentioned earlier about D&I needing to take a center stage and being right there in front, not off to the side. Your chief diversity officer is also the head of talent management. That was very intentional, wasn't it? Yes. So how does that person fold in diversity into how they seek out talent? Because we were talking earlier, and the average tenure of someone at New York Life is how long?
Like 15
years. So the average person you meet at this firm stays there for 15, 20 years. If you're there for 3 years, you're considered a newbie. So how do they fold that in to make sure that you're finding the right people, the people who want to build this company together?
Well, I think that move really comes almost 15, 20 years after we established a chief diversity officer role at New York Life. And I think what we've come to realize is that this takes hard work. And you have to embed a DEI lens into every process you have around talent. So that's from talent acquisition, having a diverse slate of candidates, a diverse slate of interviewers. It's to development and thinking about what kinds of programs really make sense for people depending on where they start and what needs they have, to the promotion process and thinking many years in advance about what are the kinds of opportunities, development opportunities they need to be in a position so that when they're up for promotion, there's no debate as to whether they should get it or not. And I think that was our realization, is that you can't just think about DEI on the side. It needs to be embedded in everything around your people.
And you set the tone. Yishin, thank you so much for joining us. Yishin Hung is CEO of New York Life Investment Management.
Thank you, Scarlett.
Please welcome to the stage Meta Vice President of Civil Rights and Deputy General Counsel Roy L. Austin Jr. and Bloomberg's Kurt Wagner.
Well, hello.
Hello.
Thank you all for being here. I think today we're talking about Steelers quarterback situation, or
we're good.
Your March Madness bracket. I couldn't remember.
I'm all about Trubisky.
Yeah,
right now,
exactly.
so we're good.
Well, that will take us 17 of the 19 minutes,
Nice.
and then we can get to other stuff. Really excited to have you. Thank you. I was thinking that we could start by simply actually having you walk through your role at Meta. You're the head of civil rights. That is a unique role. I think you're the only person that I know who has that role at a big tech company. So walk us through what you do, and specifically maybe how it's different than what I know. What I think of when I think of a lot of these tech companies, I think of diversity and inclusion.
Right.
This is different. So how is it different?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much. Very nice to have this opportunity and to talk about the Steelers. But look, so it is unique in that I don't know that it exists anywhere. This whole vice president of civil rights idea. It came out of an audit that was done by Laura Murphy, longtime ACLU attorney. Facebook invited her in when we were Facebook before Meta. Invited her in to do an audit. She spent 2 years doing the audit. Came up with 117 recommendations, and one of those recommendations was to create this position, Vice President of Civil Rights. And when I was approached about this, at first I'm like, why would I do this? Because this doesn't exist.
Right.
And then thought about it some more, thought about the reach that Meta has, 3.5 billion monthly users. And I said, you know, if I can do something with civil rights at this scale, that'd be incredibly important, potentially. And from there, have built a team of 11, covering areas from voting and civic engagement to artificial intelligence to product, policy, and then also working on law enforcement and hate. And so those are kind of the pillars of a civil rights program at a tech company.
So it sounds like with D&I, it's more how can we diversify our workforce. What you're doing sounds more like a policy role. Yeah. Are you influencing internal policies, or if someone comes to you and says, "Here's the new, Oculus experience that we're creating. Can you and your team, look at that and maybe change product?" Or are you, FaceTiming with folks in DC about external policies and how the company does those?
So we are definitely building this plane as we're flying it, and so it is actually legal in its foundation. It is the idea of civil rights laws, the risks that any company would face based on the long history of civil rights coming out of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and beyond. But it is also policy. It's also external affairs. It's also product. It's a mix of all of those things, because any of those things can impact how historically and systemically marginalized communities are treated. Mm-hmm. And so it is to really ensure that those communities are treated as well as possible.
We started this by kind of identifying you're the only person in that particular role in tech that I'm aware of. Do you know of any other VPs of civil rights at other tech companies? Is it something that you feel that we need as a tech community to have?
I'm not aware of it in any place other than
not
like
just
a
tech.
civil rights organization. It may exist in other places. So I certainly don't know of it in tech. And yeah, I think that we are proving the value of it. Just as you would have an expert on advertising, or an expert in communications, or an expert in whatever your business model is, having someone who understands civil rights law, who understands the risks that people based on their race, religion, national origin, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, or disability, having someone who every day is waking up thinking of those risks, I think is crucial for every company to have.
Have you talked to other companies about adding this position? Is that a role that you want to play or should play?
So there's a small group of us who have, some people do public policy and civil rights at some of the other companies, and I've brought them together, and we have some communications, but haven't spoken to anyone about, like, you need to have a VP of civil rights, someone who is a senior person in the company who, when the company is making its biggest decisions, can be making those through a civil rights lens.
All right, so the very important question, why did you want to work at Meta? Because I've covered Meta a long time. It is in the press constantly.
Is it?
Yeah, you would.
No.
I know this is shocking news to you. But certainly since the 2016 election in particular, there have been a lot of civil rights related issues with Meta, a lot of civil rights groups that have been very critical of Meta. You were not coming from the tech world, so what made you say, hey, this is a job that, I want this to be the next phase of my career?
Yeah. So I started my professional career as a prosecutor, a civil rights prosecutor coming out of the Department of Justice, prosecuting hate crimes and police misconduct. And there, my greatest impact was on the person I was prosecuting and the victim. Moved from there after a couple jobs and ended up working on the task force on 21st century policing under President Obama, where we were impacting the work of potentially 18,000 police departments around the country. The idea of continuing to kind of increase the impact that I could have on civil rights was what eventually ended up taking me to Meta, was the idea of, again, 3.5 million monthly users, 3.5 billion monthly users, 5 billion posts a day across our platforms. If you can alter that just a little bit to make sure that civil rights is taking into account, the impact you could have on improving people's lives, I felt, was significant enough that it was worth taking this job that didn't exist.
When you talk to folks who work at Meta, that's often, the sheer scale, right? The impact. I wonder, can you give us an example? Like, what is something you've now been in the role? What has it been?
Just over a year.
A little over a year. Can you give us an example of something you or your team have done that you feel is reaching that impact, right? Or have you, I guess, in this first year, been able to say, wow, I can't believe we did this, and now it's touching, 1 billion people around the world?
Yeah, so there are a number of things that we've done. One is the audit, as I mentioned, had 117 recommendations. So we went around the company to see how the company was actually doing on those recommendations, and we found 55% of those recommendations were actually completed. About 36 were in motion. How do we make sure that those are in motion, get completed? How do we take those that we're still considering happen? And so that's a piece of it. More specifically, we created a civil rights training. So when people come to the company, they will actually be trained on what it means to ensure that you are protecting people from marginalized communities. We have announced that we're going to do race measurement, which is something which people think that Meta already does.
And what is that? Sorry to interrupt. Explain what that is, because I don't know if I could describe.
So the idea is, how do you know there's a problem unless you actually do the research and the data to determine what that problem is? Lots of people complain about their experience on certain platforms, but do we know, in fact, that people from marginalized communities are being treated differently? Now, there's been some work done in that space at Meta previously, but not using the methods BizG and SMPC, a survey tool, and a very sophisticated additional statistical tool to dig down on that. So we've announced that we're going to do that, and we're going to move forward on that. We sent a letter to LAPD about using inauthentic accounts. The idea is no one is allowed to use an inauthentic account on Facebook, whether you're law enforcement or not, whether you believe you have a good reason to do so.
Yeah.
So we sent a letter to LAPD to make it clear that we're not going to allow that to continue to happen. Okay. There are a lot of examples like that, and as the team continues to be in different rooms, I think we're going to continue to have influence over things like this.
We've mentioned the civil rights audit a few times, which is what ultimately led to your job. Do you think Meta, or do you plan for Meta to do, audits more regularly like that? It feels like there was a lot of good that came out of that. So what's the plan moving forward? Is this something that we can expect you guys to do more regularly?
So, look, I think the audit, obviously I'm a big fan of the audit.
Yeah, huge fan of the audit right here.
New job, so. But beyond that, I think it was important to create that foundation. It was important to know the areas that Facebook, then now Meta, could improve upon. I don't know if I feel like it needs another audit. Like, I think having a team internally that has the kind of independence that my team has, being there for day-to-day decisions, is in some ways more effective than an outside audit. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have to be transparent about our work. It doesn't mean that I don't have to, and my team doesn't have to, maintain our relationships with a lot of external partners from the civil rights community and have open and honest conversations with them about what is happening. But I don't know that we need another audit if, in fact, we are successful in our work and we can show our work.
Yeah. It feels like I see a lot of tech companies in particular that often bring civil rights requests to, for example, the annual shareholders meeting, right? Hey, we want company X to do an audit or to be more transparent. And it almost always gets shut down by the company. Why is that, right? I mean, I can imagine, I can guess why companies don't want to do that stuff, but Meta did it, and it seems to have, in the long run, maybe been a good decision, seems to be working out. Why don't other tech companies participate in this stuff?
I think you kind of answered the question there when you said in the long run.
Yeah.
I think there's some short-term pain because what someone is telling you is that you're not quite doing all that you should be doing for civil rights in the short term. And no one likes to air their dirty laundry in that way. I think Meta deserves credit for having done so. They didn't have to do the audit. They didn't have to make the results of that audit public. They did so. The audit was not 100%, hey, you're winning on civil rights, you're done, It was, you have things that you have to do, and I think they've taken it seriously. Now, there's a lot more to do. There's a lot more to be done with respect to civil rights at Meta, with respect to civil rights and tech. But I think it's important to do it, but I think a lot of companies are like, well, why do I want to be out there and be criticized by some people who we've actually let in the door to tell us all the things we're not doing? Who you pay to, yeah, you pay to criticize you publicly.
Right. What is the relationship today between Meta and civil rights groups? Because usually when I hear from them, it's because they're protesting something Meta has done or they're issuing a statement of criticism against Mark or Cheryl. Do you feel that the relationship has improved over the past year since you've been there?
I obviously want to say that it has improved. I think that I have very honest conversations with them. I have an open door with them. I worked with a lot of these organizations. I come from the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ. I was in the front office at DOJ. I was in the Obama administration. I know a lot of these organizations, and I've built a team that knows these organizations as well. We have open lines of communication. I think that they appreciate the role. They appreciate the fact. And look, when we did our response to the audit in November, we showed our work.
Yeah.
And so they're seeing what we're doing. Look, social media is hard. Technology is hard. I don't know that we'll ever be at 100%, but I think we're getting better. And I think that people are recognizing that this role is an important role, important enough that they're calling for it for other companies, and it can make things better.
What is you said you talk with these groups regularly. Can you just give us a sense of what's the open line of communication today? Are you face to face with a lot of these groups? Is it your team that's doing a lot of that? Just curious how the interactions are.
It's both. It's both, and it's the company. I mean, we have an external affairs shop that is regularly in touch with them, but I have quarterly regular meetings with a group of about 20 to 25 different organizations. But I also talk to them on a regular basis if an issue comes up, if there's something that they want to tell us about. And my team, similarly, they have long-standing relationships. I think we just counted, and we have somewhere near 150 years of civil rights experience on the civil rights team. And so they know these organizations as well. And when these organizations come to us and say, hey, this is something we're concerned about, then we're in a position to jump on that and to find the people in the company who can help.
I knew this was going to happen. We're rapidly running out of time before I get to all my great questions.
Your questions are amazing. I just want to let you know. They are.
Thank you so much. It's an election year in the U.S.
Isn't it always, though?
It feels like it always is, but it actually is. What are your priorities for the next 7 to 8 months before November? Obviously, elections have been a huge part of the issue, I think, when it comes to civil rights and social media. So what are you doing, and what are you prioritizing over the next 7 months?
Yeah. So it's still being determined. I would love to say that I alone am making these decisions, but it's a lot of people in the company who are involved in the decision making. I think, first of all, making sure that people have accurate information about where and when and how to vote is kind of key. I think there's, the other pieces of it are, how do you handle misinformation and disinformation related to the election? Really figuring out what worked in 2020, what needs to continue in 2022 is a large piece of this work. But I have a team member, Liz Kennedy, who is the point person on all of our elections work, and she is as busy as one could be.
I was gonna say, what a job that. Poor Liz. Hopefully she's getting a lot of sleep now.
She's a New Yorker, so she actually doesn't need sleep.
Okay, good. There's always been a debate about who should be responsible for these types of things you just mentioned, right? We'll say misinformation about where to vote. That has historically been a huge issue with marginalized groups. And I'm wondering, is this Meta's responsibility to weed out that misinformation, to catch that misinformation? Do you need help from the government to do that? Do you need help from someone, a different outside group to do that? I'm just curious how how much can Meta do on its own versus how much do you feel like you need help from someone else in order to properly fix a lot of these issues?
Look, the issues that appear on Meta's platforms are not Meta-created issues. I mean, these are other people who are posting things. These are other people who are trying to use social media to advance whatever it is they're trying to advance. I think it's something that we have to be aware of and have to try to address. But do we need help? I mean, certainly we need all of civil society, anyone who cares about elections and voting, to be doing the right thing day in and day out. That would actually solve the problem much more easily than us trying to solve the problem. These are just challenging times. It's challenging to figure out what the truth is sometimes, and how do you make sure that the truth is at the end of the day what people are reading and seeing and experiencing.
We have 1 minute left. Let's fast forward a year from today. You've been in your job 1 year. Let's say we come back 1 year from now. What is the one or possibly two things that you want to have done at Meta in that time?
So it's hard to say. I've told my team, I said this is the get stuff done year. I didn't use the word stuff, but that's...
Yeah, we get the...
And so we have actually a list of things that we are going to try to get over the finish line. I think getting the race measurement tool set up is crucial, because if we can figure out the actual impact on protected class, that's going to be a really big deal. We're also looking at ways to make sure that this training lands. I've been to enough trainings where I walk away at the end of the day and I'm like, oh, that was really neat, and then I go about my day job.
Sure.
How do we make sure that it has the desired impact, which is really getting people to be thinking through a civil rights lens day in and day out?
And this is happening with new hires? This is happening with people already in the building? Both?
The plan is both.
Well, good luck. Do you want to make a Steelers NFL prediction right now while you have everyone's ear? Or?
Well, we already won 6 Super Bowls.
Right. How could you possibly?
What else could we really need? But we'll win another one, obviously. So
you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. Roy Austin, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate
it. Please welcome to the stage founder and CEO of Operation Hope, John Hope Bryant, Alt Finance Corporation CEO Marcus Shaw, and Bloomberg's Carol Masser.
I'm just going to tell you, we've been talking today, before. We could go for hours because this is an important topic. They're all important topics. I'm going to throw out a few statistics, and then I want to find out why we are still here in terms of a lack of diversity, especially when it comes to the financial community and Wall Street. Diverse-owned financial firms control just 1.4% of the $82 trillion of U.S. investment fund assets. And a recent report from the Government Accountability Office showed that white men hold 60% of executive or senior level manager roles at financial service firms,
White women, another 26%. Black or African American men and women each held just 1% of these roles. Latinx men held 2%, Latinx women held 1%. We've been talking about this for a long time, easily over a quarter of a century. So let me start with you, John. Why are we still here?
I think the reasons actually are fairly practical, actually. A third of this is just comfort.
Just being comfortable with who you're working with?
I mean, why is the boardroom 65-year-old white man? Because I went to school with that dude. I chased girls with that dude. He helped me cheat on my grades. It's not competence, it's trust. It's comfort zones. So you hang out with your boys, unfortunately, and hopefully one day ladies hang out with the girls. But by the way, black people do this too. We just, unfortunately, if you hang around 9 broke people, you'll be the 10th. So a lot of black folks are hanging out in places where it's not creating wealth, but we hang out with each other.
Right.
And we all need to get out of our comfort zones. Number one, love is work. Non-love is laziness, anti-love is evil. Evil exists, it's very rare. Most people are just lazy. Intellectually lazy, physically lazy, financially lazy, spiritually lazy. They don't want to do the work. Number two, Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, once said, it's hard to get somebody to agree to the truth when the lie is paying their paycheck. So if everybody is getting paid...
Say that one more time, because I know our social media guys want to put that out.
Yeah, I know, talking to me is like getting a glass of water out of a fire hydrant. President Bill Clinton, given proper attribution, said it's hard to get somebody to agree to the truth when the lie is paying their paycheck. And you know, the big example of that is the subprime mortgage crisis, 2009. When the lie is paying your paycheck, you rationalize, which is tell rational lies. The lie is we have equality. The lie is that an opportunity is going around, because it's working for you.
Yeah.
And so the thing I love about Melody Hobson has this great quote that I think applies to why the third thing will change us is, she says that she loves math because it doesn't have an opinion. And the math has changed, right? For the first time, you don't have to say it's a moral issue.
Yeah.
Diversity and inclusion, you don't have to, do this because it's the right thing to do. Well, I'd like you to, but, the South didn't get integrated in the 60s because people had a moral awakening. It got integrated because black folks who were customers in those small towns that Dr. King shut down with marches were also spinning green, the same color as their white counterparts. And the private sector ultimately said, what do we do to get our customers back? And it was Andrew Young who cut a deal to get the whites only signs down, and 100 business leaders in every town integrated the South. Were they moral? Probably not. Did it matter? That's between them and God. But it happened.
Right.
So I think right now you have an economic agenda. You have demographics or destiny. In 20 years, you're going to have a majority of minority in this country, and the color is green. And if you say there's 2 to 3% of GDP trapped under black economic empowerment, women economic empowerment, all of a sudden, smart leaders begin to angle toward that and find a new awakening.
All right. Well, okay, Marcus, come on in on this. You spent a decade on Wall Street. You were at one point the sole recruit for Bank of America.
That's right.
Tell us about your experience.
So,
Did you feel alone?
Yeah, it is a lonely feeling. Wall Street has not had a tradition of building a lot of diversity in the workforce, particularly on the investment side of the business. Those things are changing. And so you have many of the leaders, the first people that were the first woman, the first black person, the first minority on their desk or in their department, many of those people are only 40 or 50 years old in this business. When you ask about what's different, is we are now entering, I believe, a third wave of civil rights, which is being led really by the private sector. The government has done a lot and continues to do more. We saw that the House just passed the Crown Act, right? So things are changing in real time, but in order to accelerate that change, the private sector, you, I, everybody in the crowd, is doing our part and putting pressure on private sector leaders to say we need to do more in order to actually understand how we can make this a more equitable environment.
Go ahead.
What he said.
Oh, okay.
This is a third Reconstruction.
Yeah, no.
But keep in mind, we're sitting in a moment in history, but history does not feel historic when you're sitting in it. It just feels like another day.
Yeah.
And please keep in mind that Dr. King was in Atlanta for 13 years. Went to parent-teacher night, went to the grocery store, 2,600 speeches, 13 years, 6 million air miles. All you remember is the one speech, 8 minutes, I have a dream. That's all you remember, right? And so we dramatize and we want to romanticize this, but the reality was just him banging at the dang-on door over and over again until it finally kicked open. So this is a new movement, but it's in the suites, not the streets.
Right.
This is about class and poverty, not race and the color line. The new color is green, which helps all of us, by the way, because the economics are on our side, because every profitable company in every profitable region is diverse and inclusive. I come from Atlanta, the moral capital of America. It also happens to be the 10th largest economy in the US. Hello. It also happens to be the only international city in the South. Hello. It also happens to be the largest economy in the South. And it's because we made a decision in Atlanta not to argue over who was going to go to a water fountain, white or black, but who's going to get the contract. Mm-hmm. And we decided we were better together. 2 + 2 = 6. And we found a way to work together.
Well, so, okay, we were talking beforehand. Yeah. Marcus, come on in, because I feel like the money, like the understanding that by excluding parts of our population, whether it's Black Americans, whether it's the Latin community, whether it's women, whether it's LGBTQ, there's forgive me, an economic, financial reason to be much more inclusive. But I love McKinsey, but I'm tired of reading the studies that tell me this is the thing to do. It makes more sense. So,
I mean, it's this simple, right? And I look at this, I'm a mathematician trained, engineer trained. I look at numbers and I'm comfortable there. We're a $20+ trillion economy. You've got, call it 30% of the economy that is operating at a suboptimal level because of the constraints of inequity that are in the workplace. That means there's several $1 trillion that we can unlock if we can simply give people a greater level of confidence, greater access, education, exposure, experience to allow them to maximize their potential.
So how do we do that? Because that makes sense to me. That's logic. I get it.
So I'll tell you what I know. And I think that this can be a model for other industries. Again, you've got to give people value-add networks. You've got to give them opportunities to meet people. In the world of Wall Street's an apprentice-driven model. For those that are in the crowd, how many people did not know anybody? For those that are investors, was there anybody that didn't know somebody at the firm the day that you stepped in there? We have 1 out of 200 people in the room. It is impossible to get into that business just on the merit of your own intellect.
That's right.
Which means you have to know people, you have to build relationships with people. At the end of the day, none of our deals are empirically the best deal. They're the deal that we feel comfortable with because we did it with people that we trust. So how do you build networks where people can build more trust among each other?
You guys are working on that.
That's exactly what we're working on. Getting young men and young women to meet people in the business before they have to interview.
John, I mean, you've come on Bloomberg a lot, and we've talked about, money being the great divide, and you're working on it, at a younger level. What are the specific steps that, you've been working at this at Operation Hope for a while.
Yeah.
So what makes a difference that puts people into the pipeline, gives them that opportunity, those networks?
Yeah, it's relationship capital. Like, you don't have to be a genius. You have to be in the right relationship. You know all a university is? It's networking.
That's right.
All a country club is? Networking. Private clubs, it's networking. It's again, nobody in here got your job from the phone book. You guys do know what the phone book is, right?
But you and I have also talked about having that seat I remember when you came on after George Floyd on air, and I think there was a younger individual, I believe they were Black, and they said, but John, you have a seat at the table. I don't have a seat at the table. I'm not being heard. You have seats at the table with CEOs, boards, your board alone. What are they saying? Why does this take so long?
That was a really, you're so good, Kara, because that was actually that almost made me cry. It was a young Black man who was actually saying, I'm trying not to get watered up here. He's like, look, John, I don't have a seat at the table. They're not going to listen to me. They're not going to listen to my father. They didn't listen to my grandfather. What I can do is make some noise out in the street. What I can do is protest and maybe even tear some stuff up. And I know that's not leading to anything, but maybe it gives enough attention for a minute for a guy like you to walk in and cut a deal, right? That then allows me to move from the suites to the streets, and from the streets to the suites. And that really, I felt, I couldn't argue with them, right? Because here's the reality. If you're in Canada, they'll tell you by elementary school who the NHL stars are, hockey league, because they farm club them. You here in America, they'll tell you who the NFL stars, the NBA stars are, what, in middle school? Because we have a whole farm club system. Are you with me on this? But we leave corporate, banking, finance, all the stuff that drives the economy, real estate, media, we just leave it to chance. So who gets those gigs? If you're sitting at the chair of your father and he's talking about real estate, or mom's talking about stocks, and they introduce you, they take you to the country club, they take you to the alumni meeting. All of a sudden now you've been creating relationship capital, maybe with the sons or daughters of those who are successful, who you do business with. That's those who you know. So if you hang around 9 broke people, I'll say it again, this is tweetable.
You'll be the 10th.
You'll be the 10th. Whatever you hang around, you will be. Why does somebody want to be a rap star, an athlete, or a drug dealer? Because that's what you see. It's not rocket science, it's role modeling. I mean, it makes common sense. If all you see is aspirational success in your neighborhood is a drug dealer, which is an illegal, unethical entrepreneur, yes, immoral, but not dumb, then of course that's what you'll be. So what we have done at Operation Hope, 1 Million Black Business Initiative, $130 million commitment from Shopify,
right, to
create new black businesses through corporate America. We were doing with Financial Literacy for All, me and Doug McMillan, CEO of Walmart, to get 80% of the corporate Fortune 500 to make financial literacy the new healthcare, embedded into the ethos, the business model. Right. Not charity, business. Soon, corporate inclusion, getting blacks on boards of directors.
So it's no longer, go ahead, come on.
Well, I think John's point is critical, which is starting at the earliest state possible. And the work that they've done with Operation Hope has really started with people, I would almost say in utero, right? Starting with the parents, with creating financial literacy. They give that financial literacy, pass it on to their children. What we're doing at Alt Finance is the continuation of that at another place where you find density. You know, you talk about HBCUs. Being around people, right? HBCUs represent 3% of colleges and universities in this country. 10% of black college students are at HBCUs, and 20% of black graduates come from HBCUs. That is density, that is power, that is the dinner table of opportunity with people that are trying to create new opportunities for them and their family. And so if I'm a CEO at a company and I'm looking to find great, talented, diverse people who are among 9 other people that are doing phenomenal things at that table, and you want to find the 10th, go to HBCUs.
Are they not?
So I think the key is that they have tried to.
Okay.
And now they're recognizing,
what
right?
do you mean try?
What?
So,
no, I'm stirring the pot a little bit, but
yeah,
it's anecdotal. It's incidental. It's ready, fire, aim. It's when there's a crisis. It's not relationship based. It's not embedded, right? There's no embedded system. There's not that
because
farm
the
club.
effort wasn't there.
Because they're out of the comfort zone.
It's unfamiliar.
Again, you don't even have to be a racist to miss it. I think this is so important. No one's saying when you screw up that you're a bad person. Right. Please hear me. Some people are bad people, but most people are just like, eh.
So
finding opportunities at HBCUs makes sense. I mean,
that's not tweetable.
It is a business opportunity, and the networks are strong. The networks are as strong as networks from highly selective universities that companies are routinely recruiting at, right? So if you want to build and you truly care about diversity, you go to a place where there's a ton of opportunity, and we believe that's HBCUs.
Trained opportunity.
And high quality, high potential.
Quality.
Right? These students at HBCUs, many of them could go to any school that they wanted to, but they're choosing HBCUs maybe because their parents went there.
Right.
Maybe because they want to be the 10th person at that table of 9
there's probably a
that looks
comfort
like
level
them.
too. We talk about comfort, right?
That's right.
And feeling that they're going to be in people are going to be in an atmosphere. Like we all gravitate. Well, I guess, what would you tell go?
So here's some data to attach to what this brilliant work that he's doing. Tony Ressler and some others have put this thing together. I think it's brilliant. I love Tony Ressler. And here's some data for anybody watching this to match what he's talking about. According to Citigroup report, there was a $16 trillion, not billion, not million, $16 trillion miss in the last 20 years, Carol. Not 400 years since slavery, not the last 20 years because of discrimination against blacks alone. It's a miss in GDP. So that if you just knock it off, by the way, you pick up $1 trillion a year, which pays for the stimulus from the pandemic for the last 3 years. Just knock it off. So if you do the right thing for the right reasons, just with black Americans, not women, not Latinos, not Indians, there's all kinds of categories that are untapped.
Right.
Just blacks. You get a 2 to 3% pop in GDP.
But then I go...
It's a direct line to HBC. You should be running him down to get to an HBC.
I'm here after.
But that's why I go to where we started.
Why?
That makes, that's money to be made. An impact on our economy.
Is our greed
so
bigger
why
than our
have we
hate?
not...
So Kara, the only problem you have, you're rational. So, I love you, Kara. So
My
look,
husband doesn't think so.
So look, check it out. Look, why do we have this? Why do we have civil rights?
Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do.
Seriously, though.
I do,
I'm a math person, too.
Yeah, but real talk. We live in their country. What was the Civil War about? The Civil War is about the South resisting Northern economic domination. That's it. It wasn't something else. It was I got free labor, I got a mansion, I got a horse and buggy limousine. And why would I want to change this? Just because you think it's morally correct because the future is in the North? And it took a war to switch that, but it was really about the South not wanting to give up that old system. We don't need a civil war. We need data. And what the data right now will set you free. The data says if you want future GDP, if you want growth, if you want an opportunity, you can take no pleasure from the fact there's a hole in my end of our boat.
Does the tech community know that?
Well, I think the tech community is doing a great job. And so in the tech community, innovation is the alpha, right? That is how they measure performance. And what the tech community is seeing is that people, regardless of their background, can bring tremendous innovation to the workplace.
Right.
In the financial services community, we're talking
And mind
about...
you, the tech community isn't perfect. There's been a lot of reporting about lack of diversity. But anyway.
But we're seeing them do some intentional things, right? And we didn't get here unintentionally, so we're not going to get out of here unintentionally, right? We got to this type of...
Say that again.
We did not get here unintentionally, all right? The limitations on minorities in the workplace was not on accident.
Right.
It was part of a framework.
Right.
And so we cannot unwind that by accident. We have to be intentional.
Okay, so unfortunately we only have a minute left yet. My thing is, why can't we all just be like Bridgerton? But I can't. You want that.
That really happened. That's true.
No, I know.
Yeah.
It's like...
The word white was a made-up word from the 1600s. It's made up.
Right?
We don't have time for this conversation.
Okay. All right, so... Hashtag Bridgerton. Okay, so we have about a minute left. Otherwise, they're going to kick us off. Give me an intention that we should all be thinking about going forward in 30 seconds.
So the number one thing that we can do in the alternative investment community is think about how we create more networks and more access for students, particularly with what we're working with, Black and African American students, to find pathways into the space. Be a mentor, create relationships, build internships, and be intentional about creating diverse opportunities in those internships.
John.
Very quickly, you want to every year judge yourself by your About Us page. Look at your board, look at your management team, look at your structure every year, your About Us page in your corporation. What does it look like? Does it look like America, right? Number two, do something. Don't make the perfect the death of the good. It's like a software upgrade. Do something, and then do something a little bit better tomorrow, and keep at it until you change somebody's life. Number three, understand this, we're not at war with each other. This is not about black or white or red or blue, Republican or Democratic Party. We're at war. China wants to be us, be clear. Russia would like to be us, they're too small, they're irrelevant, they're an irritant in the world. But these folks want to be us, they want our way in the world. But everybody wants to be an American except Americans. We keep fighting with each other over stupid stuff. We are better together. 2 + 2 = 6. Why this? Because this is how we win.
Marcus Shaw, John Hope Bryan. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Please welcome to the stage Henry Cohen, Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School, Dr. Derek Hamilton, and Bloomberg's Ben Steverman.
Hi, Derek.
Hello.
Welcome. Thank you for being here. I think we wanted to start by just talking about baby bonds. So the subject of Bloomberg Business Week's cover story, which I wrote, is this concept of baby bonds that you came up with more than a decade ago. Let's start by just saying, explain to us what is a baby bond and what is it designed to do?
And I'm going to start with gratitude. If you have not read that article yet, the article is a parallel of my life with a policy proposal that was developed and is now being thought about in state houses across the country, as well as at the federal level. But Ben, his ability to capture the essence of me is personally gratifying, I think extraordinary, and my family, who, they didn't choose to have a public persona, they were so proud of it. So it's personally meaningful for me, and I really want to start with gratitude before we begin this talk. So baby bonds, what are baby bonds? Baby bonds are a birthright to capital. It is saying that simply by being born, there will be a set-aside amount of resource reserved for you that when you become a young adult, you can have access to an endowment to begin a lifetime of building wealth, building the economic security associated with wealth. So really, they're trust accounts. And the concept is a right to a trust account where it wouldn't be reserved only for the wealthy, but for everyone.
Except the poor kids would get more money. And what? Well, why don't you tell the story of how you came up with this idea, and that we can walk into how they're designed.
Again, as the article describes, I had, as some people might say in a cliche form, a tale of two cities. I grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant. I went to an elite private school downtown Brooklyn, Brooklyn Friends School. And I was able to attend that school because of sacrifice and my parents basically being in over their head. But what we talk about in the story also is that this is not a story about triumph, because I lost my parents. I lost my parents in my teen years for what I think is the result of stress. But nonetheless, they exposed me to that education. So I could play football with my neighbors who I grew up with, and then I can go to Brooklyn Friends and play basketball with the children of elite people, and I could see that in essence they were not different. But yet if we watch their trajectories, one might end up literally robbing an armored car, and the other could end up literally an investment banker. And the difference between those two pathways was capital. The difference between those two pathways were resources that their parents had. So what this is proposing is, again, a set-aside amount of resources so that that child who grows up, regardless of whether they're black, white, Bedford-Stuyvesant, or Brooklyn Heights, can still have a pathway towards economic security.
And when you came, this is really building on decades of work that you and others have done on really talking about wealth and talking about the racial wealth gap. So why are baby bonds a way to tackle the racial wealth gap?
I like to describe them as, from a policy standpoint, race neutral, but in practice, they are anti-racist. And what makes them anti-racist? We're, at this point, pretty much all familiar with the racial wealth gap. The racial wealth gap is dramatic, such that the typical black family generally has about a dime for every dollar held by the typical white family. And we're not even talking about mean. If we look at the mean, then the difference is far more dramatic. If we look at the mean, the typical white family has, the average white family has close to $1 million in wealth. But we know that's not typical for most white families. So looking at the mean, looking at differences between the experience of what happens typically across families, white people have less wealth far more wealth than black people. And the result is not because of some effort or some educational disparity, but rather it's rooted in history. We know that a white asset-based middle class never simply emerged. It was federal policy. It was the GI Bill. It was the Homestead Act. And we know that when those bills were enacted, although they may have seemed facially race neutral, they didn't explicitly say that black people could not be part of the homesteaders, or black people couldn't get a GI Bill, but they were administered in a racial way. They were designed in a racial way. For example, Social Security. Social Security in its original form excluded domestic and agricultural workers. And what happened in 1930? The typical, a black woman who was employed, 90% of them were employed as a domestic or agricultural worker. For black men, it was over half. So that was clearly a racist design. So what baby bonds can do is, they're not reparations. They're not substitutes for reparations, let's be clear. But what they can do is, going forward, they can ensure that everybody has access to some capital to redress some of the historical disparities that have emerged. They almost become an automatic stabilizer. So an automatic stabilizer for your family who might be, you could imagine being born into a family where you could have been your parents could have been a doctor, and then they get sued for malpractice. Their child still would need some access to wealth, even though at one point they might have been wealthy and now they're wealth poor. So in that sense, baby bonds become an automatic stabilizer that is counterintuitive for U.S. policy. Usually we associate social mobility with one's family. This is saying that as a child, irrespective of your gender, your race, or the family position in which you're born, you will have some set aside for you as a right so that you can reap the rewards of whatever ingenuity you have or whatever effort you might want to bestow.
So in your original proposal, you were thinking about $50,000 to $60,000 that the poorest kids would be able to access when they hit 18 or early adulthood. This is an idea that's gaining real momentum, and it's happening on the state level. And the states can't afford $50,000 to $60,000 per kid. But what they're doing is both DC and Connecticut have already implemented these things. I'm getting some of the information out of the way. And they're basically starting with about $3,000 and then investing it and hoping it'll be more like $10,000 or more by the time these kids get to be 18. They're only focusing on the Medicaid-eligible kids. So it's about half of babies born in Connecticut and DC are Medicaid-eligible. So it's a good number of children. And then we have real momentum in Washington State, Massachusetts. We have proposals. The governor of New Jersey has proposed this. We have legislators in New York. Mostly blue states are really getting serious about this, and they have they're doing pretty well financially right now, just because of stimulus money and other things. So this is one place they're putting the money. Tell me how you feel about the political situation around baby bonds right now and the momentum it's getting. Are these state programs enough?
The state programs are a giant leap forward. We don't need to wait for the federal government. We can start demonstrations at a local level. We can build up momentum, political momentum, at a local level with the goal, the North Star is the federal government. The federal government is the entity that has the capacity to ensure that every child has a birthright to capital. As you mentioned, Ben, the biggest obstacle, particularly on a state level, is finance. The capacity to seed that money, especially when they're dealing with more emergency situations on a regular basis. But the federal government does have the finance capacity. Let me also say something about the universality of it. What is elegant about the program is its stakeholder society aspect. Again, whether you're born into the most wealth family or the lowest wealth family, you get a stake in our society. So they're just like Social Security. That makes that program elegant. But what you also need, in addition to the universal aspect of everybody being eligible, it has to be progressively seeded. If it's not progressively seeded, then it's inflationary. If you literally gave everybody the same amount at birth, then what you're doing is enhancing inequality. Those that have more will be able to add to their wealth portfolio in a compounded way. Also, if you literally gave everybody the same amount, you raise the price level for assets in a general way. So it's useful for it to be progressive.
And what do you envision this money being used for? You actually would put some strings on this.
Yeah. And, you know, a lot of people contrast baby bonds with guaranteed income, or worse, dare I say, universal basic income. I'm not a fan of universal basic income for some of the reasons I just mentioned. I am a fan of guaranteed income. I am a fan of the child tax credit. Simply by being a human being, one needs income. We've seen from some of the experiments that have been done at local levels, you know, the conservative critique that literally giving people money, you will dissuade them from working, you'll discourage them from work. The opposite occurred. By offering people resources, they were able to engage in more work. They were able to overcome all types of circumstances that a state probably couldn't anticipate in order to be more employable. Well, similarly, baby bonds is offering people resources, and you might say, well, why restrict it? Why not let them use it for anything they want to use it for? It is not intended to be paternalistic, but rather it's intended to be specific for the goal of the program. Income and wealth are not the same. Income is necessary and useful, but it is a flow good. It is a periodic reward for some activity. Most Americans get it in the form of labor, but it can come in return for capital as well. Baby bonds is dealing with wealth, which is perhaps a paramount indicator of economic security. It affords you to go to a college, an expensive college. You're not going to finance that out of income. If you're faced with the criminal justice system and you need to hire an attorney, you're not going to be able to finance that out of income. If you want to go into business, you're not going to be able to finance that out of income. Wealth provides agency in one's life in a way that income doesn't. Therefore, baby bonds is not intended to be paternalistic, but rather keenly focused on getting young people in an asset that will passively, and that's the key word, passively rise over their lifetime. Like a home. What is the difference between a homeowner and a renter? Often a down payment. What is the difference between a worker and a business owner? Now, obviously, I'm being somewhat facetious, but you can be a worker with all the ingenious ideas in the world. If you don't have capital to actualize that idea, you're limited. So what baby bonds does is it redresses some of the exploitive and extrapolative, being able to extrapolate from people aspects of a market by shifting power to them, by offering them wealth so that they can, in an authentic way, have agency in their lives.
This is great. Why? I've been talking to legislators across the country about this idea, and it's not just urban legislators that want to do this, and there's some broader appeal. Why do you think this idea is catching on and gaining some momentum around the country?
I mean, this is not about capitalism or socialism. You know, I'm intentionally using the word economic right because the reality is that for markets to work, people need some power to engage in them. If you enter a market with nothing, you have nothing by which to bargain with. You are simply at the whim of markets or the whim of charity. So, I had a good friend that wrote an article about baby bonds, and I loved her title, An Idea a Conservative Should Love. Because if you're authentic about your belief in markets, then you would hope that people are well-resourced so that they can go into that market and again, authentically bargain for and trade in a way that can lift them up.
One of the quirks is a lot of rural areas these days are represented by Republicans, and these places have also lost a lot of capital and economic development over the last decades as well. So that's one of the arguments I kept hearing.
You're right. I mean, capital flows will go into areas that have been depleted of capital. You know, it becomes, I used the word automatic stabilizer earlier, it would be applicable here as well. So if you imagine areas that for various reasons might have divestments or loss of capitals, what baby bonds does in an automatic way is sends resources in those areas, not just to people, but to geographies. So in that sense, it becomes useful. I mean, in fact, we heard in the previous panel some of the discussions about being an American versus living in another society. again, the idea of a birthright, this should transcend borders. You should imagine that developing countries, if we want to be true to our humanistic spirit, everybody should have some capital set aside from them for when they become an adult and be able to utilize it.
Let's, if you don't mind, talking a little bit more about where you're coming from, growing up in Bed-Stuy. But when we were talking about that for the Bloomberg profile we did of you, you really didn't like that rags to riches story. You didn't want to be seen as your story to be seen as inspirational and an inspirational success story. Why is that? What's behind that?
I mean, we cherry pick. We pick examples of successful cases, and what we don't do with those stories is all the other evidence of systematic evidence of people that did work hard, that did study hard, that were not successful. So those anecdotes are inauthentic. They're not actual. And then also, if you look at my own personal case, I say this in the article, I'd rather have my parents. If I had the choice at 18 of having access to pathways that could lead me to be a professor through that expensive Brooklyn Friends education that they afforded me, or have them, I would have made a different choice. But that choice wasn't afforded to me. So that's a tragic choice that they made. And that's a tragic choice that millions of families are having to make when we ask them to grit, to actually be superhuman. We ask them to be above average. Everybody can't be above average. So, LeBron James in a commercial one time pointed out that, I get this narrative of coming from a humble beginning and making it. And in this Nike commercial, he said, I want to live in a society where there are no more humble beginnings. And that's what I want. I don't want humble beginnings. If we want to have true competition, if we want to have true human rights, then we need to eliminate humble beginnings.
Yeah. Well, I think we have a couple more minutes, but that is a really wonderful place to end, I think. Really appreciate you coming in and sharing your wisdom with us and sharing your thoughts for the Bloomberg story. So
thank you, Ben.
All right, thank you a lot.
All right. Hope you guys enjoyed this morning's program. We're about to break for lunch, so please make your way to the networking lounge for lunch. But for those of you who are participating in the Boston Consulting Group session, please enter the room to your right. When you exit, you'll see signage and Bloomberg staff to direct you for that session. Thank you. We'll be back at 1:45. Thank you.